All right, this is from pages 124 and 125 of Dagling's book, Bigfoot Exposed, that we just mentioned. It was a slow afternoon in New Haven when I decided, for lack of anything better to do, that I would verify this claim, and this is the claim that we were just referring to. I headed off to Yale's Science Library and began searching various databases. Having found what I wanted, I spent a few minutes in the stacks tracking down the Anthropometry Sourcebook, a thick book containing a comprehensive assortment of measurements on the human body from a number of populations. Pulling the large volume off the shelf, I found statistics on height and measurement called the Intercye. I'm not sure I'm saying that right. That's INTERSCYE.
I'll go with that.
Okay. This is an armpit-to-armpit measurement and gives you an idea of how wide an individual's chest is. Conveniently, this measurement is taken across the back in the same way that Krantz was compelled to measure it on the film since the subject was heading away from the camera. For this variable, I had before me a set of data on over 1,000 individuals. Not a very big sample compared to all the people running around, but big enough to establish how bizarrely Patty was shaped. I'd like to interject here. I like the way Dagling writes. He's well educated and he's taking a very formal approach to all this, but he's also very casual. And
it's readable.
It's a good book to read. I was astonished and poring over the tables, but not because it was dawning on me that a flesh and blood Bigfoot had been caught on film. Instead, I was dumbfounded that Krantz, who was a respected scientist at a major research university, could have been so sloppy in making such a bold claim. If no human existed of the dimensions Krantz gives, then about 5% of members of the German Air Force were in need of zoological reclassification.
Well, they were all the big guys, remember? The big bald guys in Raiders of the Lost Ark who have the fist fight with Indy.
Got backed into the prop?
Yes, that guy.
The impossible, he's got that in quotes, dimensions of the film subject were anything but. The numbers were clear. If that was a Sasquatch, then it had the body proportions that can be found in people walking around today. I left the library considerably annoyed, and I became deeply skeptical of the remainder of Krantz's argument.
Yeah, well, there you go. Like we said before starting this little section here, is that he had a problem with the end claims, we could say. So a little bit of professional disagreement, and maybe a good counterpoint to what Krantz is saying is that he's maybe recklessly making these declarations, but also we don't know what data he's pulling from Krantz. He details it quite a bit in his book, so if you're that interested, you can go check it out. Compare the two.
What's interesting about Krantz is when he came into this, he was a non-believer. Then he became a believer. And so then if you're looking at the confirmation bias and how that might have influenced his results, and this happens to everybody, once you get to wherever your own mind is, it can start to taint your results. But on the other hand, Krantz has passed away, and we don't have the ability to ask him or have him defend why his suppositions were correct and Dagling's are wrong, because he's not around anymore.
Yeah, those two guys need to hash that out. Well, the other thing that Dagling and Schmidt looked at was the gait, the walking speeds. That's the other thing we can glean from the film to analyze. And regarding the walking speeds and gait, René de Hinden had people at the film site try and keep up with Patty's pace and found that if the film had been shot at 24 frames per second, they could not keep up with her pace. At slower film speeds, they could keep up. And Dagling found that when he duplicated the test with his students, he found the same thing. Daniel Schmidt found, though, that if you do a primate's compliant gait type of walk, or how Groucho Marx would have jokingly walked around while doing a bit, you could achieve a faster gait.
Yeah, this is, if you haven't seen the Groucho Marx walk, this is also a walk that looks a little bit like cross-country skiing.
It's bending the knee quite dramatically, like 90 degrees, putting your leg far out forward and being lowered to the ground and doing a kind of a crazy walk.
But even Groucho Marx didn't step super high like Patty does.
Yeah, he's a much shorter man. So he's walking at that crazy gait. And I'm also thinking of Monty Python's, was it the Institute of Silly Walks?
The Ministry.
Sorry, yes. It is British, so it is Ministry of Silly Walks, of just doing something goofy. So that's kind of like what they're describing there as that primate compliant gait. Now, the problem is that when a human walks with knees and hips bent like that, you can travel faster, but you also tire out more quickly. So Dagling and Schmidt found that their human test subjects could walk faster than Patty was in the film when they were doing the compliant gait. Now, Scott here is going to give us all a brief description of a compliant gait from the BFRO website, the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization.
Most Sasquatches are observed walking, and the observer almost invariably comments on their smooth, long, and fluent stride. like cross-country skiing or like riding a bicycle with wide arm swings. This effect is produced by their so-called compliant gait, meaning that they do not lock their knees during a step, but keep them bent and thereby suppress the up and down oscillations of the body that is so characteristic of the human gait. Part of the Sasquatch gait is a high foot rise and back during the swing phase and a longer bipedal contact with the ground. Step length averages 5 feet, an interval that is uncomfortable or impossible to duplicate or sustain for any distance by a would-be hoaxer. The gait has very little straddle, meaning the feet are put in line.
What I noticed in looking for a good short definition of a compliant gait that wasn't a bunch of scientific gobbledygook was that this also seems to be in debate amongst, I think, primatologists and anthropologists and people who study mobility. And that there was a paper I found which said, hold on now, this may not be a real thing, and gave a long argument.
About compliant gait?
Yeah, just being such a defined characteristic with primates. Gorillas will walk a short distance, and we've seen other monkeys and lower primates walk like that. But they're debating, is this a natural outcome for walking primates in general?
I would like to make an armchair anthropological observation.
Please do.
That actually occurred to me the other day, and I forgot about it, and I think this is as good a point as any to bring it up. When you're doing a compliant gait, or you're doing that silly walk, the Groucho Marx walk, and sometimes I do this walk. Here's when I do this walk. When I'm in the mall with my son, and I want to walk really quickly away from him in kind of a funny way.
And make him laugh.
Yeah, and make him laugh. I'll bend my legs down and walk like that. And I do cover more ground quickly.
Yeah.
But the other thing that I can do is that thing that you see certain birds do, where you can essentially stabilize your head. You can make it very, very smooth when you're walking this way.
Right.
It's very different from how you bounce up and down, or your head does, and therefore your primary sensory input between your eyes and your, well, let's just say your eyes, because your eyes are bouncing around when you're walking the way you normally do. So this is what's interesting to me about this, because I used to, when I was younger, I was real fascinated with birds, and I would read about the birds, because you see these birds, like the reason that a pigeon does that walk like an Egyptian thing.
Yes.
Or other birds are capable of holding their heads perfectly still. You see all these videos of the baby owl holding its head perfectly still while you move its body all around. That is done so that it can be a better predator and process its surroundings better. So it has developed or evolved this series of muscles and a behavioral pattern that allows it to better assess what's going on in its environment.
They can hold a target better, you're saying?
Yeah, just in general, because what they're doing is they are their own personal image stabilization. It's built into them biologically,
there you go,
and biomechanically. It's interesting to me to think of the idea that if Patty is a real creature, that she may have developed this compliant gait as a defense mechanism, because in walking that way, she is able to look around almost like the Terminator. She has a stabilized point of view, and the information that's being fed into her brain is being stabilized by her head because of that weird walk. And maybe that's a reason that you would evolve to that weird walk in the wild. It's a self-defense mechanism.
Well, there are some evolutionary arguments.
Don't I get that was like a guitar solo.
You didn't talk about.
Give me something.
Well,
I came up with that.
Tell me more about chickens and pigeons, though, because it's
well,
it's more of a Mick Jagger funky.
I always thought it was hilarious why the pigeons and birds did that, and I looked it up. It has to do because their eyes are on the sides of their heads.
Yes.
Has to do with how their visual cortex works with their brain, and they process information.
Okay.
Now, Patty's eyes obviously aren't on the side of her head, but that stabilization thing does kind of offer an advantage over uneven terrain if you're in an environment where you want to be more aware of your surroundings.
Very good. Yeah, you do hit on another thing that I've been thinking about, and I'm going to try to remember to talk about it in our conclusions, though, is that you are trying to compare what you see on the film there, Patty, with known morphologies of humans and apes.
Did you just call me Patty?
Yeah. Let's go with that. That's all we have. That's the data sets we do have. We've studied apes and higher primates for a long time. We've studied humans. We have databases for them. And so you're seeing something that's not one or the other. It's somewhere in between. So what characteristics would fall on that needle from one side to the other? And that's what's interesting here, and I think that's what's baffling. We'll talk a little bit about your note here on Daegling, commenting on Bob Titmus's initial field, his calculations, because I believe what Daegling is saying here is that those are probably error-filled, or at least have a few errors.
Well, there's some of that. This section that I wanted to mention is actually more specifically related to the tracks. And Bob was a tracker, and so Daegling made some observations about Bob Titmus and the tracking information associated with the PGF site in Bluff Creek. This quoting from page 170 of Daegling's book. Bob Titmus, who may have seen more tracks in his life than any other investigator, was clear in his conviction that no claim to authenticity could be made for a single print regardless of context or documentation. This is an admirably skeptical position from someone who claims to have actually seen a Bigfoot on 2 occasions. He goes on to say, Bob Titmus was impressed. Nothing whatever here indicated that these tracks could have been faked. On the other hand, Richard Henry, and that's another investigator, expressed, quote, mixed emotions about the event recorded by the tracks, since he stated that, quote, I could not find where they started, and the sequence of footprints looked symmetrical and mechanical. Now, Lyle Laverty, who we apparently have someone by marriage related to this gentleman, he may have been the first person to see the tracks after Patterson and Gimlin had departed. He worked in the park system there. He was intrigued enough to take some pictures of the strange footprints, but he too has expressed some skepticism based on the proximity of the film site to a road and on his own experience in the months preceding the film. He had heard the tales of disturbances on Wallace's, he's talking about Ray Wallace, who was the track hoaxer, on Wallace's operation, but he had never seen any tracks at all that he couldn't explain until Patterson and Gimlin had come and gone. So anyway, it's just interesting. This is just a little bit of this more skeptical side, but again, it's actually both sides, and that's what I like about how Daegling wrote the book. Because first he's talking about how Bob Titmus seen a lot of tracks, and he said, I can't say that this is a hoax. But on the other hand, he's saying, Laverty, well, I don't know. I've heard about Ray Wallace, and I never saw any tracks in the area that were weird until Patterson and Gimlin came and went. However, that logic is a little bit of failed logic for me. It's like, yeah, well, they saw a Bigfoot. Because you can say that either means, yeah, well, they hoaxed a Bigfoot, so now you're seeing tracks. Or it's because they saw a Bigfoot and that Bigfoot left tracks on that day. So yeah, they happen to be there at the same time, whatever. But anyway, again, I know we have a lot of listeners that lean to the more skeptical side, and we've got a lot of books that we've read at least parts of. It was hard to read them all because we got like 10 on this one. But if you're wanting to take the broader look at the big picture, I would look at Daegling's Bigfoot Exposed book, which is not just about the PGF. It's about Bigfoot in general. So
right.
But it's something to check out.
I think we, though, can definitively conclude, though, that the reasons the tracks just appear with no origin spot is because they're interdimensional.
Oh, come on. Don't go there right now.
I'm not. I'm just joking.
That's the other reason that the speed's weird, because Patty's not fully in our dimension.
Wow.
See, the time is different where she's actually...
I did not even think of that.
She's projecting. She's doing a Luke Skywalker thing.
Well, good for you, man. I didn't...
with footprints.
I did not even bring in the Skinwalker Ranch aspect of this. That it's just she's probably 2D. Who knows? But
she comes here for the Snickers bars.
The idea is that you don't bring that up with these scientists. They will have none of it. And the ones that are serious about studying this hate it because it just cheapens the brand, as you could say. Well,
you're making it look cheap.
Well, because it just, we don't have any information on that. But the people who do believe in that kind of stuff, I'm sure they'll latch onto that and just thinking like, well, there you go. How did it just disappear into the brush? These guys are professional trackers, and it got too thick. It's big, it's powerful, it doesn't feel pain
but Bob
much.
Also broke off because Roger was scared and alone.
Right.
I'm making a joke about Roger, but he had no gun, no horse, and he was out of film. So.
Well, no, I don't blame him.
And he wanted to know where the baby was, the baby Bigfoot.
Yes, I don't blame him at all. But people will say about the encounter, though, that it was kind of strange that she did seem to just kind of disappear into the undergrowth. And
that's true.
I mean, he stopped. Bob Gimlin stopped, but it wasn't like he saw her barrel a path through, like you would see a hippo going through the brush.
Yeah.
It just seemed to kind of fizzle out. Anyway, that's weird. But let's get back to the things that we know about the film here. Because of the camera's variable film speed being unknown. Well, that's an unknown thing we don't know about the film, or we do know. I don't know.
It's unknown. It's a known unknown.
Exactly.
As Rumsfeld would say.
The other thing that's unknown is the actual distance the creature traveled, because that's only an estimate with probable errors. And because of all that, the actual walking speed estimate is imprecise. This is according to Daegling. But even so, and with Patty seeming to use a compliant gait to move faster than normal human walking, Daegling then argues that she wasn't moving all that fast, and that a human could walk faster than she does in the film by also using a compliant gait. So it does seem she's moving quickly. She's determined. It's a determined walk. But what Daegling is saying here is like, it's not like she's sprinting or it's impossible to match that. Because according to Daegling, the argument that the creature's body proportions or Patty's gait and speed were not human doesn't prove the Bigfoot seen in the film is the real deal. And therefore, it's possible the film is still a hoax. So you see, that's the scientific side, is that they're not saying, like we said earlier, coming out and claiming, well, there you go, it's a hoax. They're saying that can't be ruled out, but we can't go either way on this. We just don't have enough good data. Therefore, you can't make good conclusions. For Daegling, one variable remains that is not easily ascertained from looking at the film, and that is stride length in relation to the compliant gait. Now, as reported by Daegling, the creature's stride, for example, this would be left heel measuring to left heel. One full locomotor cycle was measured at the film site as ranging from 280 to 305 centimeters, or about 110 inches to 120.1 inches.
Okay, I want to jump in here real quick.
Yeah.
Because earlier we were talking about Grover Krantz and we mentioned a 41-inch stride length.
That's right.
And we were quoting something there, but it turns out that's a misspeak in a way, because there's a difference between a stride length and a step length. And I want to explain this a little bit, because obviously there's a huge gap between 41 inches and 110 inches. So which is it? Is Bigfoot taking these huge steps or little tiny baby steps?
Right. Well, no, I wondered that when I came across those two figures, because those are jotted down. And it's like, well, those differ vastly. So who's right?
Well, what's happening here is I think a lot of researchers and people that are digging in on this are misusing the term stride. So this is something that we looked up. I actually found this at reference.com/science/length average walking stride. That's got hyphens and a long number after it. So I'm not going to try and give that to you, but I'm just going to read this real quick from there. The length of an average, this is human, obviously not Bigfoot. The length of an average walking stride is 62 inches. People frequently mistake stride for step length or wrongly assume they are one in the same. That should be one and the same. There's a typo right there. They wrote one in the same. One and the same.
Well, maybe they're Canadian.
Yeah. Step length is described as the distance between the heel strike of one foot and the heel strike of the opposite foot. So that's your step length.
Right. Like the back of your left heel measured to the back of your right heel.
Exactly. And just one step apart. On the other hand, stride refers to the consecutive heel strikes of the same foot. Stride roughly equates to 2 steps. Stride length varies based on the length of a person's legs. Because men tend to be taller than women on average, males typically have longer strides. Overall, a person expends more energy by taking longer strides when walking. Let's unpack this. The length of an average walking stride, according to this, is 62 inches. So if you look at that, that would mean that the step length for an average person would be 31 inches.
Okay.
What we're going to say is that even though there was a reference to a 41-inch stride length for the Bigfoot tracks earlier, that actually was probably a step length.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Which would then, in turn, equate to an 82-inch stride length, which is interesting because that's 20 inches longer than a human average stride of 62 inches.
Yeah, that's what Daegling goes on to say, that this figure is beyond the ability of normal human walking, except for some very tall people. However, when humans employ a compliant gait, a compliant walk, the stride length increases dramatically. So Daegling and Schmidt compared their normal stride lengths with their compliant walking strides and found a 35% increase in the length.
35%. So that's
when you're doing the goofy walk, when you're doing the Groucho walk, that increases by 35%.
Okay.
So then they measured their compliant stride lengths as ranging from 288 centimeters to 293 centimeters, or 113.4 to 114.5 inches. So to Daegling, their compliant stride length could match Patty's, which might be either her normal walking pattern or a clever affectation by a guy in a suit thinking that they should walk strangely or knew about primate locomotion and compliant gaits. Well, you know what I'm saying there is that, like, let's do the goofy Groucho walk or the Ministry of Silly Walks.
Well, it seems like a strange decision to make if you're wearing a costume, because at that point, I would think if you're staging a hoax, you're doing something that's kind of goofy. And I would think that the people who are shooting the hoax, like if Roger Patterson is conducting a hoax and Bob Hieronymus is doing the compliant gait, which is we're also calling the Groucho walk, or like as I said a few minutes ago, the silly walk that I do with my son sometimes to quickly get away from him in the mall. without moving my head at all.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about that is I feel like Roger would be like, what are you doing? That is the goofiest. You're ruining it.
Well,
that's like if you were staging this, if I was directing the hoax, I'd be like, why are you walking like that?
Right. Again, the critic would say, well, no, they studied up on some primate ape walks and kind of figured that's how that kind of lumbering
but wasn't it
is
Krantz
maybe...
that said he brought, the Gait and all that to Hieronymus and he just kind of glazed over?
Yeah, then the critics would say, well, no, Roger was still acting. He was an excellent actor.
No, I'm talking about Bob.
No,
wasn't it Bob
No,
who glazed over?
it was Roger.
That was Roger.
Yeah,
okay, so Roger was pretending to be dumb about primate walks.
Yeah, Roger was trying to figure out or keep up with what Grover Krantz was telling him about, as far as ape behavior, characters and dimension of walking, gaits and all that, and, trying to talk to him about that. And he said, well, he just looked like a student who was not really getting it, but trying to keep up, doing his best. But, again, that's a human calculation.
Me, what I look like sitting across from you right now.
Exactly. Yes. Well, that's on the social side. Well, Roger was playing dumb. He really did study up on these primate gaits, and he either instructed Bob Hieronymus to do it, or Bob Hieronymus knew he should do some kind of lumbering gait like a big oafish ape would, maybe. Yeah. I don't know. It's a bit of a stretch, but there you go. It's not totally out of reason.
Not out of the realm of possibility.
It's not out of the realm of possibility, and that's what people like Daegling would say about Krantz's conclusions. So in summing up that, to David Daegling's thinking, he didn't have a problem with Krantz's analysis of the film in regards to errors in computation or lapses in reasoning. Really, Daegling thought it was a laudable effort to get as much information as possible from a poorly documented situation. What Daegling has a problem with is Krantz's conclusions from his analysis, which he thought were, just too reckless, optimistic, and confident. Simply put, that since the body proportions were unusual, they weren't human, and since the walk wasn't typical, no human could imitate it. So in Daegling's opinion, both conclusions are indefensible. So you can see where these two scientists' feelings lie, in that Krantz is like, well, I don't know, I'm convinced. I've studied it. I wasn't at first, but I've studied it. I think this is the real deal. I'm doubling down on this. And Daegling says, well, how can you do that?
Well, Daegling's calling Krantz on his seeming confirmation bias. Krantz has made up
his
mind.
Yeah, sure.
Daegling, on the other hand, may have some confirmation bias in the other direction.
Right.
Somewhere in the middle of these two is probably the reality of whatever Patty is.
Exactly. So I would say, though, that Daegling and Schmidt's conclusions probably fall within a mean of most scientists' thinking, in that, quite simply, because of all the shortcomings and probable errors and uncertainties of the available data, it's impossible to definitely conclude that this subject in the film was non-human and that a hoax is still a possibility. That's where they have to keep it. It's like, well, we can't rule out a hoax, where I think Krantz can. And that's the differing of opinions there. So, as Daegling and Schmidt stated in an issue of Skeptical Inquirer, May to June 1999 issue there, titled Bigfoot Screen Test, quote, based on our analysis of gait and problems inherent in estimating subject dimensions, it is our opinion that it is not possible to evaluate the identity of the film subject with any confidence. They're just saying, look, this is bad data. We can't go there. Some have, we're not going there. So anyway, however, Daegling has stated that if it was a suit, it was better than a lot of the monster costumes you saw in the movies and TV of 1967, because special effects were primitive in that day. However, Bill Munns had a thought about that, didn't he?
Yeah, coming back around to Bill Munns, we actually have an interview with him. That's going to be the next part of this series. It's really fascinating. He is a costume designer and a film analyst who has taken a harder look at the PGF film than probably anyone in history, with the most modern technology. But one of the things that he mentioned in his own book, which is called When Roger Met Patty, that you'll be hearing about more in the next part of the series, is this comes from page 95 of 492 in the, I'm referring to the Kindle edition here. I'm just going to read this right out of the book. One thing that should be cleared up is the error that the ape makeups and suits of these films were not, quote, the technology of the time, end quote, that the PGF was filmed. In David Daegling's book, this is Munn speaking now, Bigfoot Exposed, Daegling writes on page 112, it is very important to remember the date of the film. In 1967, we were still a few years away from Planet of the Apes and 2001, Space Odyssey. Ape and monster costumes were not very sophisticated and apparently hard to come by. Munns goes on here to say, Daegling is incorrect. Planet of the Apes was released on February 8th, 1968, a mere 3.5 months after the PGF was filmed on October 20th, 1967. And Planet of the Apes was filmed from May 21st, 1967 to August 10th, 1967, before the PGF was taken. The makeup designs and tests would have been done even earlier in 1967. 2001 Space Odyssey was released on April 2nd, 1968, a mere 5.5 months after the PGF filming, and principal photography, that's when you start the official shoot, began December 1965 and was completed in September 1967 before the PGF was taken. And the ape suits would have been developed and fabricated well before they could be filmed. So in both cases, the ape costumes and effects of both films can be considered the technology of the time. But how that technology actually compares with the PGF is a matter often misunderstood by people who are not knowledgeable in the actual process and techniques of, quote, creature work. I don't want to go too far down the Munns rabbit hole here, but I'm just going to read this last paragraph and then just know that you'll be hearing more about him in the next part of this series. And this is from page 96 now of his book. The work done for Planet of the Apes actually has little resemblance to what we see in the PGF. The Planet of the Apes were done with facial prosthetic appliances glued to the actor's face, blended and then painted to finish, and lace front wigs were then applied to finish the look. The actors wore full costumes of cloth or leather to appear dressed in armor, garments, or similar civilized fashions. The PGF creature is a full and apparently naked body of something humanistic in anatomy, but covered almost entirely by a hair or fur, as humans normally are not. If it is a hoax, the technique for making a full body costume is far different from the techniques of Planet of the Apes. So there you go.
Yeah, we're going to hear about the guy who worked on that groundbreaking makeup for Planet of the Apes and won an honorary Academy Award for his work years before they started handing out a category for Oscars for best makeup effects. So it's a little different. So keep that in mind. That's what he's saying, Munns is, that, you know, and what's funny is that he's the expert in that field, not Daegling.
And I also want to point out that gentleman that you're going to be talking about, his budget for Planet of the Apes, $1 million, $1967.
That's a lot of money back then.
So I don't think Roger and Bob had access to that kind of money to create the costume that they did, but more on that later.
And a much different type of costume is what Munns is pointing out. So it's just funny to see experts in their field chiming in like, well, not exactly. Well, like this.
And this is what I think demonstrates Munns' even-handedness, is what he's pointing out here is that, because Daegling was trying to say that this was actually before Planet of the Apes and 2001, Munns is actually saying, no, it's right at the right time. That was all the right time. But then he goes on to say, although those costumes look absolutely nothing like Patty.
Right.
That's just what to consider. So he's given us the full picture there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, well, here are my concluding thoughts on just this interchange here between Krantz and Daegling, or just what's been mentioned so far. You tell me if any of this makes sense or if you have some thoughts on this. One, if the body proportions exist in a small percentage of the human population, then you really have to look at, does the person who's come forward, the one person who's come forward, claiming to be the man in the suit, Bob Hieronymus, match those proportions, either wearing a skin-tight suit or one with highly sophisticated padding? You're looking at a broad swath of logic, and really it comes down to something that Chris Murphy said that we started this section with, is that there is possibility in that. If you look at possibility, it's like, well, it can be achieved in humans. This is not impossible, these body proportions or the walking gait, the compliant gait. But then you have to look at, is it probable? So when we look at the probability factor for the PGF, well, you have one guy who's come forward claiming it was a hoax. It was him. It's me. It's Bob Hieronymus. I did this. Well, does Bob match those proportions? Or could he in a sophisticated suit? And to get to that proportion, how sophisticated does it have to be? Is it beyond the probability of that being possible? So that's one thing I wanted to make sure that we thought of here, all of us, when we're considering if this is a hoax. Another thing here is, none of the calculations can be totally accurate, including Daegling's and Schmidt's, I think in a lockdown scientific manner, and they would agree with this, I'm sure, because you're not actually measuring Bob Hieronymus, the guy who's claiming to be the ape in the film, and his walk. Although I guess you could have measured perhaps the recreation walk he did for Greg Long, but that didn't happen. You know what I'm saying? You got the physical guy there.
Yeah, and Greg Lung wouldn't even release that picture for Munns to use in his book.
Yeah,
he wouldn't
because
give Munns the one picture, and it's just a picture of Hieronymus walking in front of a fence.
No,
he
wouldn't give that to Chris Murphy either, I think, because it doesn't really hold up.
Yeah.
It's not that accurate, and I think he was afraid that's going to be pointed out. But that's what I'm saying, is that you don't have the actual people objects here, including Patty herself, to measure against Bob. You know what I'm saying? To get a real scientific lockdown on this, data-wise. You know, Daegling and Schmidt tested out their normal walk against their own compliant gait. And you can make some reasonable extrapolations from that, but they can't accurately measure the compliant gait of the subject in the film. If Bigfoot is a new type of primate species we're totally unaware of, is it sufficient to compare it to and expect satisfactory matches with the physical properties of apes or of humans? Because Bigfoot, it seems, has its own morphology, different from both higher primates. You know what I'm saying? She's her own thing.
Yeah.
So is it...
We need to compare apples to apples.
Exactly.
And we can't, because she's the only apple.
Right. Not comparing an orange to a Tangelo or
yes.
some kind of weird hybrid, because she's somewhere in between. That's what it seems to be the case here. So to get it accurate and to measure her, you really need her.
Yeah.
And she's not cooperating. So, if it's possible for a human to exhibit those body proportions and compliant gait, does Hieronymus have or could have those characteristics? That's what I'm saying. And if it's not Hieronymus, then what guy in the suit did? So essentially, it's all inconclusive to me, and we'll never know. But keep in mind here, even if we can't consider hard data, we can still consider probabilities. So if Bob Hieronymus couldn't fit the body proportions, was there someone still unknown to us that Roger was able to get to wear his sophisticated costume? We don't know. Would Roger or the suit wearer then be clever enough or knowledgeable enough to do the compliant gait? So those are the questions I have after reviewing the arguments here that we just discussed.
I think with regard to Bob, if the costume does not fit, you must no.
Oh, please.
No, but here's what I'm saying. It doesn't work. And then if someone else is wearing a costume, where is that person? That person has kept a secret for 50 plus years, which nobody does in the case of a hoax this big. People just don't do it. The only other possibility would be that the person, like Roger, passed away fairly shortly after that.
Yeah,
and,
it could be.
Kept it a secret, lived in a Kaczynski-esque cabin somewhere, and no one's found the costume and got away with it.
Right.
Because to me, Bob just doesn't work, frankly.
Yeah.
Hieronymus does not work here as a person wearing this costume. And for me, also, the Philip Morris story doesn't add up. I do believe there's a possibility of an additional costume, but having looked at the ones that the Morris company made, which are awesome costumes, I'd love to have one.
Yeah, they are.
But they don't look anything like Patty.
Right.
They've not put one forth that looks like Patty, and any recreation that's been created, not just by them, but by anyone, looks nothing like the Patterson Gimlin film. No one has been able to reproduce it. Yeah. And all this stuff runs into a dead end for me.
I just put up a blog posting, as you'll see in our links here, which does show a photo of Philip Morris with he's a juggler and a blogger.
Got that costume.
He does have an ape costume with him. So people could say, well, there you go. He's holding the ape costume, because this ape costume weirdly has breasts on it, it seems.
That were clearly put on
later.
After the fact.
Yeah, but it's also like a lot of other ape costumes. The belly is plastic
belly.
And it's bare. It's totally bare. And as Patty turns, that does not seem to be the case. So that doesn't match. But it is credited somewhat as being similar to the one sold, or a recreation or a simulation of the one sold to Patterson. And I will say the face looks closer, because it has a bit of a sagittal crest, and the cheeks and the nose are bare.
Yeah.
They don't seem to have any hair on them, so it looks different than what you would see in a normal gorilla face mask headpiece.
Yes.
Maybe patterned more after what was seen in the film, possibly, but the rest of it just is not quite there. So that's the closest we'll ever see, but again, it wasn't offered to be studied. It's just like, well, here's something that's similar, and not put up. So yeah, there are pictures of him with something that was, I guess he's claiming, Mr. Morris, before he passed away, that is closer to what Roger would have had, but not the same one, again, because the one that he claims that he sold to Roger did not have breasts on it, that Roger modified the suit possibly after he received it. And Philip Morris says that he was asked that by Roger, how to make the arms longer, this and that. So the suit that he's showing is not exactly what he is saying that he sold to Roger back in the day.
Yeah, and I wanted to add, because one of our listeners, a friend of ours, had asked just today if we ever heard back from Philip Morris's family about doing an interview, because we did talk to them, we did exchange a few emails with them, but we have not heard back, and at this point, I don't think we're going to. We did try to reach out to them, just wanted to let everybody know that. It was totally amicable email exchange. It just, the interview just didn't materialize.
They're probably just really tired of talking about it by now.
Yes, as I'm sure everyone who's listening to this is
tired of listening about it by now. Well, then let's move on to another major proponent of the PGF and Sasquatch in general, and that would be Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum. He is a biological anthropologist, anatomist, and professor at Idaho State University, specializing in vertebrate locomotion and foot morphology in primates. So there you go. This is exactly the type of guy you want to talk to. But of course, because of his willingness to even look at the subject and be in favor of the possibility of Sasquatches, he's dismissed outright by many. But his credentials are there. So he's authored many papers on evolutionary morphology and the emergence of bipedal locomotion in modern humans and Bigfoot, and is one of the more well-known expert proponents of Bigfoot and the Patterson Gimlin film. And therefore, of course, he's received a lot of criticism from his scientific peers in the community and the public as well. Well, however, there was a nice comment from Brian Dunning on Meldrum's wiki entry, and this is what Brian Dunning wrote about him, quote, "The work of responsible scientists like Dr. Meldrum is exactly what true skeptics should be asking the Bigfoot community for, not criticizing him for it."
Yes, and for those of you who don't know, we've mentioned Mr. Dunning several times on the show.
Yeah.
He is the guy behind Skeptoid. He's a prominent skeptic who has touched on everything we've ever touched on.
I think most of it, sure.
Yeah, on most of it or whatever. And we have respect for him, but it's interesting to hear him saying that about Meldrum.
I would say Mr. Dunning is pretty even in a lot of stuff. We don't always see eye to eye, of course, but what he's saying is like, if you're going to ask the Bigfoot community to get some real science behind it, this is the guy to be asking. So stop criticizing them for getting this guy involved. That's what you should be looking at.
Right.
So I applaud that. Yeah.
I do as well. All right, so getting back to Meldrum, one of his arguments on the creature in the film being real is the focus on what anthropologists call the Intermembral Index, or IM. I know that many of you will know that as an instant message, but in this case, it's something else.
Yes.
The Intermembral Index is a ratio used to compare limb proportions expressed as a percentage. The formula is calculated in this case by adding the length of the arms divided by the length of the legs and multiplied by 100. Meldrum cites that the average IM index in humans is 72, an IM index of 117 on average for gorillas, and an average IM index of 106 for chimps.
Mm-hmm.
That's humans 72, gorillas 117, chimps 106. In studying the film, Meldrum calculates that Patty has an IM index somewhere between 80 and 90, putting her in the middle between humans and African apes.
Aha, see? I knew she was somewhere in the middle.
Patty in the middle. Even though this measurement is not all that precise because you're only looking at her in a film clip, Meldrum firmly states that anyone can see just by looking at the film that you can tell the creature in it has disproportionately long arms in comparison to its stature.
I'll buy that.
Therefore, the IM of this creature indicates that it is well beyond the mean for humans and effectively rules out the possibility that it's just a man in a costume, unless incorporated into the costume was some sort of elaborate, if not inconceivable, complex prosthetic mechanism that could produce the actions and positions you see of the wrist, elbow, and finger flexion in the film. Quote, "This point deserves further examination and may well rule out the probability of hoaxing," end quote. Meldrum says in his 2015 BFRO article, that's the Bigfoot Field Research Organization. The article is called, quote, "The Truth Before Our Eyes," end quote. Now, Meldrum cites the fieldwork of John Green in his studies, as well as the analytical calculations of other researchers, like computer-animated effects expert Ruben Steindorf. Steindorf used an interesting technique called reverse kinetics to generate a computer model of Patty's skeletal anatomy. He was able to provide a reasonable estimate of Patty's intermembral index by tracking her joints through 116 frames of the film, which gave an unusual ratio of limb proportion in that the upper extremity was rather long compared to the lower.
Yeah, she's got real long arms and shorter legs.
From Steindorf's computer model, the IM for Patty is approximately 88. For an average human, as we said, the IM is 71 or 72. This, combined with the exceptional breadth dimensions, has Meldrum concluding that it's an effective argument against the suggestion that Patty is an average man in a costume, even if he was wearing shoulder pads or using arm extensions in the suit.
That's another weird thing. So what they're saying is that, remember we talked about Bob Hieronymus saying he was wearing gloves that were just a little longer than his actual hands.
Right.
Philip Morris said that Roger asked him how he could make the arms
He
longer.
said to hold sticks.
Sticks, yeah, just put sticks to extend them in there. But
which makes it hard to move the fingers.
Well, that's one thing you can see. And again, even you and I were, when we were first reading these after years after seeing the PGF, I mean, really looking at it, we can really see this stuff, but I recommend everybody taking a very close look then at a good clip of Patty. And when you really start to look at it, not just kind of casually, you do see the fingers curling up as she does her backswing of the arms. I do see a prominent calf muscle, and you can see the legs flexing. And again, if that is a suit, because we can't really say, we certainly have our strong ideas about it, but you do start to see muscle movement and flexion in the fingers and elbows and the shoulders moving. And like I said before, deltoids and triceps and the muscle groups where they should be. So that is what Jeffrey Meldrum is saying, is that you would have to have some kind of contraption that mimicked all that. And it seems, again, in this case, unlikely. So that is what Meldrum is saying, is that when you take this calculation of the intermembral index, it's strange. She is a strange unto herself creature in that long arms, shorter legs. Remember, we thought that Bob Hieronymus had longer legs than Patty, as far as like hip
His
socket.
legs were very long. When you look at the pictures, and specifically from between the knee and the foot.
Right. So that alone, when people line that up in a film frame of comparable size, those joints don't line up with Patty. So because
she has a really long torso and the long arms.
Right.
In a primate kind of way.
Yeah, shortish legs.
And as we have said earlier in this series, you can't fake where your joints are. It's not something you can do. I don't care what kind of costume you're wearing. Your knee is where your knee is. You can't choose to move it a few inches.
Yeah, you can make them longer, but you can't make them shorter.
Yeah.
You know how we always say Mack Weldon is the most comfortable underwear, socks, shirts, undershirts, hoodies, and sweatpants and more that you will ever wear?
I do, and it's true, because Mack Weldon believes in smart design, premium fabrics, and simple shopping. So not only are you looking sharp in insanely comfortable essentials and casual attire, ordering them from the website is actually a pleasure.
Well, speaking of pleasure and comfort, I've been wearing their Radius pant for a while now, and they've become my go-to pair, especially for air travel.
Well, I hope you're washing them every so often. I mean, they are made with high-tech, water-resistant, wind-resistant, and stain-resistant stretch fabric, so you might get away with that for a while.
All right. Let's get all your pants jokes out of the way. What else you got?
You also probably benefit from the wicking and quick-dry interior, not to mention the flex waist at the sides.
Well, I'd protest, but I'm actually enjoying those features too, especially the flex waist. But seriously, the Radius is the perfect combo of a weekday, weekend, or travel pant, all the flexible movement and feel of a workout pant, but with the stylishness of a dress pant, so you could wear them to the office and be rocking a modern fit and classy comfort, and no one's the wiser.
How many times are you going to say the word pant?
As much as I possibly can, because this is a pant I believe in.
Well, I'll give you that. Pair them with Mack Weldon's precision-engineered socks, shirts, and underwear, and it's smooth sailing in style. I'm also glad that you've upped your pant game.
Yeah, thanks. But here's a great deal for everyone out there in listener land to up your essentials game. A discount to try out Mack Weldon's line of modern basics. They want you to be comfortable, so even if you don't like your first pair of underwear, you can keep it and they'll still refund you. No questions asked.
So for 20% off your first order, visit MackWeldon.com and enter promo code LEGENDS at checkout.
Once again, go to Mack Weldon, that's MackWeldon.com, and enter promo code LEGENDS at checkout. So often we know the famous names throughout history, but aside from that, most of us don't know that much about them, which is why the Great Courses Plus is such a great resource. You can use their vast storehouse of knowledge to drill down on anything you want to know more about.
Yeah, you can learn about everything from how to improve your fiction writing or your cooking skills to Tai Chi workouts or the places you want to travel to.
Precisely. So, you've heard of a ruler who bankrupted his empire by building an outlandish palace for himself with 50 lavish dining rooms and then put a 120-foot high high golden naked statue of himself outside the front door, and then he planned to have his favorite racehorse appointed to the highest office in government?
You're not talking about a current head of state, right? Well, you must be talking about Caligula. He's one of those names a lot of people have heard of, but in the lecture series, The Roman Empire, From Augustus to the Fall of Rome, over at the Great Courses Plus, you really get to know how he came to power and how the Romans, who were so opposed to having a king, let that happen.
Yeah, a lot of it has to do with the Emperor Augustus, who we talked about last time. Even though he had many positive achievements for Rome and became the model for his successors, one major flaw was the precedent he set for choosing future emperors. The next emperor would be the closest male blood relative of the previous one. Also, Augustus's reign was so long, his system became the future model, and by his death, no one remembered what the old republic was like.
So then after Augustus's more suitable heirs all died young and some political intrigue, you end up with a crazy murderer like Caligula. Well, until they'd had enough of his shenanigans and he was assassinated.
Yeah, if really learning about stuff you always wanted to know more about interests you, as it does us, here's that push you need. A special limited time offer to get you started.
Here's how you can get a free trial of the Great Courses Plus. Plus, lock into their lowest price of only $10 per month when you sign up for a 3-month plan. That's 50% off the regular price.
That's an incredible deal to get unlimited access to the Great Courses Plus, but it's only available for a limited time and only by going to our special URL.
To get your free trial plus 50% off your monthly plan now, go to thegreatcoursesplus.com/legends.
Remember, that's thegreatcoursesplus.com/legends.
Hi, I'm Rachel Stokes, and you're listening to Astonishing Legends with Scott Philbrook and Forrest Burgess. Now back to the show.
Okay, time for another expert. It's time to talk about Esteban Sarmiento. I love his name.
It's a
Esteban.
fantastic sounding name.
Yes.
But of course, we have another scientist disagreeing with another scientist. That's part of the pastime. That's just part of the contract you sign. You're going to
We've
disagree.
all got to disagree with each other.
Well, there are groups that agree with each other. Although not totally, they may have some differences in practice or approach on something or conclusions, but generally they all accept the same methodology to a large degree, so at least you have a starting point. But with Dr. Sarmiento, he does disagree with Meldrum's conclusions about the creature's I am. And Esteban Sarmiento is a primatologist and biological anthropologist. And you may have seen him on Monster Quest. I don't know if you watched that. Have you?
I'm sure I've watched all of those. It's been a while now. Obviously, they've been gone for a while. But
again, I'm just totally lost.
One of my favorite Bigfoot stories of all time was the Monster Quest episode. But that was the one where they went to the hunting cabin that you could only get to by seaplane. And someone was throwing rocks at the cabin on the last night. They were like, we didn't see anything. And they were going to leave. And then something went crazy on the cabin.
Yeah.
And they got so scared they just went inside.
That's a common
Get out there and film it.
Well, you do trail cams. Yeah, something I learned from the Bigfoot's blog website. That's run by Stephen Stroyford. I think I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Stephen Stroyford. He runs the Bigfoot books in Willow Creek, and it's a staging center. It's a headquarters almost for that area. Yeah, for those researchers who do a lot of field stuff. And they were saying that they've set up trail cams, like a bunch of them, a lot in the actual area, and are going to monitor them for the years to come just to see if anything happens. They've captured a lot of really cool wildlife in there, cougars, bear, all kinds of animals in there, but not a Bigfoot yet. But they're ready. So they're actively in the area, in that Bluff Creek area there where Roger and Bob were on horseback. And they were part of the group there that rediscovered that site in 2011, I believe, and mapped it out with GPS coordinates. So we have that link on our website for the shows.
Yeah, they did a lot of mapping. There's coordinates and the drawings of every downed tree. It's really awesome.
Well,
it's really cool stuff.
I think that they know that to avoid a lot of criticism, you're going to have to be as scientific and accurate and thorough as possible. And that's what they've done. They've mapped out every tree there that they could find. I think 2 of the main trees that were there are no longer there. They're gone. But yeah, so they basically found it again. Because of the overgrowth, it was lost for quite a while there after the incident. And what you can tell is like it's very dense in there. It's very rugged and dense. And you'll see that also with Bill Munn's scan composites from the film. He's mapped them and knitted them together so you can see the terrain from the film, which is really interesting. Well, getting back to Sarmiento, he argues that the IM index of the creature is in the normal human range, and he estimates Bigfoot's weight to be between 190 to 240 pounds, so well within average dudes.
Right.
So just another disagreement about the data here.
I think a lot of people in much the same way they say, oh, they hear about the Philip Morris costume or Bob Hieronymus, and they go for that cognitive closure. Oh, well, that explains it. I want to point out that even if you come around to a conclusion that Patty weighs roughly the same as a human being, there is absolutely no relationship between that concept and the idea that she's definitely a human being.
Right, right.
There is no reason that she could not weigh the same as a person and not be a person. Just wanted to point that out for people that are like, oh, well, 190, it's a person. Yeah. That's not what we're saying. No. All we're saying is that this particular scientist, Mr. Sarmiento, believes that her weight is more in the range of someone, for example, like me. I'm not going to say where I'm at, but between 190 and 240 pounds. I'm working on it. I'm on a diet.
That seems accurate. Yeah. I'll go with that. But if you go with the story of the tracks as well, the 3 different sizes of footprints found in the area, and hopefully, one of them is not Ray Wallace's wooden footprints there, that there's 3 different sizes, that there is a juvenile, a middle range, which might be the female, Patty here, and then a big old daddy, which must be monstrous. And people have reported around there seeing full-grown male Bigfoots, and they are frighteningly huge. Scaries. Now we're talking, I don't know, maybe 8-9 feet tall and taller.
Yeah.
Patty might be dainty, but she will still twist you into a pretzel. So you don't dare approach her too closely or quickly here. But what I do like about Sarmiento is that he is one of the few mainstream scientists that gives cryptozoology any consideration. And he thinks it's possible Bigfoot may exist, but that proof of its existence has not yet been established, and any evidence found deserves careful study. So there you go. He's open-minded to it. I'll take that. A quote from him about the PGF. If the animal in the P&G film is real, this animal is exceedingly human-like. It would be our closest relative on Earth, end quote. If it is real, then what he's saying is it's more close to humans than apes here, but I don't want to put words in his mouth, but it's one of our distant, long-lost relatives, perhaps. But in connection to his comparison of Patty to other primates in appearance and behavior, Sarmiento sees some inconsistencies like the color of the palms, which appear dark, as opposed to the soles of the feet, which appear light. And he doesn't know of any other mammal in which this coloring differs so much. But what I would say is to remember the argument about the Philip Morris soles of the costume feet being dark. According to Morris, that's what he said. Remember, the soles of his costume feet were dark, and yet they appeared light in the film. And that, remember, maybe they were lightened because of the clay in the soil.
Right. That's what I was going to point out. The clay in the soil, because that's something that Bob Gimlin has said too.
Right.
The fine silt in the stream bed of Bluff Creek had a light color to it. So
right.
It's a little bit of a leap, I think, on Sarmiento's part.
Yeah.
To not calculate that the surfaces that the bottoms of the feet are being exposed to might be affecting the color of what the bottom of the feet look like. Yeah. Especially in the stream bed there.
Right. So keep that in mind. Yeah, that clay is kind of a light grayish bluish color. And that is one of the things they said, is that might have been tinting the color of the feet. So yeah, again, it's hard to determine exactly what colors we're seeing there. But another objection is that while Patty has big hairy buns, she doesn't appear to have a significant human-like butt crack or cleft.
Wait, is that a scientific term, butt crack?
I think cleft is, but okay. I like the term butt crack.
You baked it right in there.
I did, yes. I don't know if it's cleft. People know what we're talking about, hopefully.
Yes, hopefully. Everybody has one. Well, everybody has one.
Yeah, primates, I think you got something like that. And she does, as I can see, but to Sarmiento's liking, he would expect to see more separation. And I would understand this looking at the film, is that you do see a line there, but they're not very rounded. And so I could see his thinking being maybe it's a costume and you're seeing a seam there, but it's not like real flesh, where you would see more roundedness and separation. And perhaps it's all that hair that's concealing it, maybe.
I really wonder what Sir Mix-a-Lot would think.
He would love it, I think, until you got down to ground zero. And then it would be, no thank you.
Yeah.
We're not making a joke here, is that a couple of scientists have seen her hindquarters.
Yeah.
And it didn't look real to them because they're not seeing enough of that separation that which you would see in people or some apes.
Yes.
So it's unusual. But again, Pandy's her own thing. She's got different morphology, perhaps. Or it's a costume which got it real close, but not great for them. But in general, Sarmiento concludes that Pandy's proportions are well within the human range and quite different from any living ape or Australopithecine fossils. So while he sees inconsistencies with the creature on the film and what is known about primates, which might point to a hoax, there is nothing conclusive he could spot that proves it's a fake. So again, he's not outright saying it's a fake. It's just he sees some consistencies, he has some disagreements, and that's where he's got to leave it. And actually echoing what Grover Krantz said about opposing scientific studies, there really doesn't seem to be many, if any, detailed scientific debunking point by point of the PGF, mainly just disagreements about data and findings of other scientists who've examined it and gave a favorable opinion for the film being authentic. So I'm just saying that in case you were wondering if we were favoring or shading an opinion by omission. We didn't really stumble across anything that's point by point, and we certainly would have presented it as well as a counterpoint.
Okay, we're going to talk about another expert here. He was a certified forensic examiner. His name's Jeff Glickman, and this is fascinating because it's a different take, yet another take on Patty.
Yeah, visual image expert.
Yes, and he was formerly with the North American Science Institute, which is no longer around, but they did a 3-year study on the Patterson-Gimlin film using intensive computer analysis. And the result of this was a 43-page scientific study with 13 pages specifically about the Patterson-Gimlin film. An interesting connection, Jeff Glickman was recently commissioned by TIGAR, that's the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery.
TIGAR, yes.
Yes, to examine their findings from their Amelia Earhart investigation on Nikomoro. These are the guys that are the biggest proponents of the castaway theory on that island there.
They had some artifacts, and they had Jeff Glickman take a look at them. I found that to be an interesting connection there when you don't usually put Bigfoot together with Amelia, but everything's connected.
Everything is connected.
So Amelia, I'm sure she would be shocked by that.
While Mr. Glickman seems to be a very well-credentialed forensic examiner and had actually started his own company, Photech.
Yeah, you ever heard of them? I think I have vaguely in connection to investigations of certain things.
Yeah, I think they are an internationally recognized forensic image processing laboratory specializing in image enhancement and reconstruction. It should be noted here that the North American Science Institute does not seem, that's the one I mentioned earlier, like a majorly recognized scientific organization. Now, it appears they have or had a paid staff that took over the research for the Bigfoot Research Project in 1997, run by researcher Peter Byrne, and it was Byrne who commissioned Glickman to analyze the film. I'm just mentioning this in case there are any complaints that NASI is not a credible organization, but Glickman appears well suited for this analysis.
I believe, we also came across info that NASI shut down right after the report was commissioned.
Yes.
I think according to Daegling.
Yeah, according to Daegling in his book on page 131 of his book, if anybody wants to read more on that, Daegling talks about Glickman.
Right.
Glickman's research report was titled Toward a Resolution of the Bigfoot Phenomenon, and it was issued in June 1998 and contains 11 points of findings that are summarized as follows. Number 1, measurement of the creature, height 87.5 inches, waist 81.3 inches.
Dang.
Yeah, it's a big waist. Chest 83 inches, weight 1,957 pounds.
Yeah.
We'll talk more about that in a minute.
Okay.
Length of arms 43 inches, length of legs 40 inches. Arms longer than legs, which is interesting. Number 2, the length of the creature's arms is virtually beyond human standards, possibly occurring in 1 out of 52.5 million people. Point number 3, the length of the creature's legs is unusual by human standards, possibly occurring in 1 out of 1,000 people. Point 4, nothing was found indicating the creature was a man in a costume, meaning no seams or interfaces that would indicate that that was some kind of costume that had been put together because it would have assembly points. Number 5, hand movement indicates flexible hands. This condition implies that the arm would have to support flexion in the hands. An artificial arm with hand movement ability was probably beyond the technology available in 1967. Point number 6, the Russian finding on the similarity between the foot casts and the creature's foot was confirmed. That's one of my favorite points, is that
Yeah.
the tracks are not generated by a separate hoax, which is probably how you would have to do that if you had a costume. You would need to treat the tracks and the costume as two separate things that you had to deal with.
Right, meaning that the foot on the costume then is actually what made the tracks, or you have to then make another contraption that puts, that has a tremendous amount of weight.
Yes.
That's what people were suggesting, like, well, that's possible too. It's like, yeah, but is it probable that you would then have this other contraption that makes a really heavy depression with the same exact foot characteristics?
Yes, and you have to get to and from the scene of the crime without leaving any tracks or marks anywhere else.
True that, yes.
Yeah. So there are some theories on that, something about cars riding along next to you. This is not a place where you could drive a car, so that doesn't work. Anyway, point number 7. Preliminary findings indicate that the forward motion part of the creature's walking pattern could not be duplicated by a human being. Now, again, this is according to Glickman. Point number 8. Rippling of the creature's flesh or fat on its right side was observed, indicating that a costume is highly improbable. Point number 9, the creature's foot undergoes flexion like a real foot. This finding eliminates the possibility of a fabricated solid foot apparatus. It also implies that the leg would have to support flexion in the foot. An artificial leg with foot movement ability was probably beyond the technology available in 1967. Point number 10, the appearance and sophistication of the creature's musculature are beyond costumes used in the entertainment industry. And point number 11, non-uniformity in hair texture, length, and coloration is inconsistent with sophisticated costumes used in the entertainment industry. And that's something that Bill Munns goes really deep on. And we'll talk a little bit about that with him in his interview in the next part of this series. Jeff Glickman's closing statement on his analysis is as follows, quote, "Despite 3 years of rigorous examination by the author, the Patterson-Gimlin film cannot be demonstrated to be a forgery at this time," end quote. So getting back to that astronomical weight.
Yeah, that's the one thing that a lot of other, even proponents of the film disagree with, is that seems like a very high calculation of weight.
Yes, and apologies to you, Patty, for having this discussion without giving you a chance to chime in.
Defend herself?
Yes.
It's holiday weight?
Yes, this is a 1 ton. The main criticism about Glickman's findings is that high weight calculation at 1,957 pounds. Now, in order to estimate the weight of Patty, researchers also need to estimate her height while standing fully erect, which she never does in the film clip because she's walking the whole time. Since each of the major researchers that have put forth estimates use different frames of the film for their calculations of walking height, their numbers differ in the amount of inches added to determine standing height.
Yeah, she kind of hunches over. She's got huge traps, as the guys in the gym would say, a huge trapezius. To get decent findings on her proportions, you have to have her standing fully erect, still at the top of her height, which she never does in the film.
Right, and here's where you're going to see these heights are a little bit all over the place. Dr. Grover Krantz estimated a maximum walking height of 72 inches, or 6 feet tall. John Green, 80 inches. Dmitry Bayanov and Igor Bortsev around 78 inches, and Jeff Glickman, 87 inches.
Yeah, so you can see his height estimates are
higher.
Yeah.
Which would affect his weight.
Exactly.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly. So how much do you add to the estimated walking height to determine a height standing fully erect, and thus an approximation of the weight? Well, Dr. Krantz used a calculation of adding 8 to 8.5% to the walking height and arrived at a standing height of 87.5 inches tall, or 7 foot 3.5 inches. From this, biomedical researcher Dr. Henner Farnbach estimated the weight was more likely closer to 542 pounds, or 245.8 kilograms.
Yeah, I think that 542 pounds is easier for a lot of other researchers to swallow than the 1957 poundage there. But I believe Jeff Glickman never revised that. He stood by that figure. He's like, well, that's what I got.
Yeah.
You guys work it out yourselves.
Well, everybody's sticking to their guns.
Right. Well, remember Dr. John Napier?
No, I don't. Did we talk about him already?
Yeah, it was hours ago for the listener, weeks ago for us.
Yes.
Well, Napier was a British orthopedic surgeon, primatologist, and paleoanthropologist, a specialist in hands and feet of humans and primates, and was one of the scientists at the Smithsonian screening back in 1969. Remember that,
Oh,
right?
yes.
Yeah.
Now I remember him, yes.
Yeah, there you go. Well, Napier was at one time director of their primate biology program and was one of the first well-known scientists to study Bigfoot, becoming fascinated enough by the evidence he'd seen to write his own books from 1973 entitled Bigfoot, the Sasquatch and Yeti in Myth and Reality. And I think just Bigfoot is the title from 1974, but that may be just a reprint title, maybe just the one book there from 73. Well, Napier, if you remember, also studied the cripple foot track and the dermal ridges on the footprints. That, I think, really hooked him.
Right.
Those dermal ridges. Well, anyway, this guy's no slouch. He's no crackpot here. An expert in exactly what you want hands and feet of primates and people. So Napier was convinced that Sasquatch existed, and he said so in his book, but he didn't think the Patterson Gimlin film was real. But it seems, on the other hand, he may have been on the fence about the film, because you can find somewhat conflicting statements by him regarding the PGF. However, these may be taken out of context, and we must admit we haven't read his book entirely, so they just seem a little conflicted. I'm going to go with him being just kind of on the fence. Again, he's giving it the possibility, Sasquatch being real. He's not sure about the PGF, though. For example, saying in his book, quote, "There was nothing in this film which would prove conclusively that this was a hoax." And he says this on page 89, and then on page 95 saying, quote, "There is little doubt that the scientific evidence taken collectively points to a hoax of some kind. The creature shown in the film does not stand up well to functional analysis," end quote. So he's kind of vacillating here a little bit, sounds like. I don't know what to make of those two quotes from the same book.
Yeah.
He's saying that he's not sure, and then he's like, well, but also it's not real solid. Not entirely kosher for him. And the two main problems that Napier had with Patty involved her feet, and he was an expert in primate hands and feet, remember. So
Yes.
He thought the length of the footprints were at odds with her estimated height, and that the footprints were of the hourglass type, which he thought were suspicious. I'm not sure about that. To me, they seem pretty rectangular, not much shape to them. So in any case, that's one thing he had a problem with, but I'm not sure what he meant by that, because they don't seem to have an hourglass shape or any kind of longitudinal arch to me. But like everyone else, Napier is making assessments based on indirect evidence from the images in the film and footprint castings, even though he thought this indirect evidence was inconclusive and not solid so as to prove Bigfoot was real to him anyway. It was compelling enough that he thought Bigfoot shouldn't be dismissed outright and was worthy of serious scientific study. He's open to the idea. He's just not sure about this whole PGF thing and what's been presented, so he needed more information. So another thing you find on page 95 was another good quote summing up his feelings, quote, "Perhaps it was a man dressed up in a monkey's skin. If so, it was a brilliantly executed hoax, and the unknown perpetrator will take his place with the great hoaxers of the world. Perhaps it was the first film of a new type of hominid, quite unknown to science, in which case Roger Patterson deserves to rank with Dubois, the discoverer of Pithecanthropus erectus, or Raymond Dart of Johannesburg, the man who introduced the world to its immediate human ancestor, Australopithecus africanus."
Okay, we got just a few more guys to talk about here. These a little bit less information on them, but still they're important in the big picture. One of them is Bernard Heuvelmans.
Or Heuvelmans.
It's Heuvelmans. Bernard was a Belgian-French zoologist, field researcher, and explorer known as one of the founding fathers of cryptozoology. He was also inspired by our man Ivan T. Sanderson, who you may have heard us talk about many times, even in this series, who was friends with John Keel, as a matter of fact. And during World War II, Heuvelmans escaped from a Nazi prison camp and then later worked as a jazz singer in Paris.
Wow.
Yeah. That'd be a guy that I wish we could have interviewed.
Yeah, put him on the list. We should have talked to. But that's just fascinating guy. But I love that he also embraced cryptozoology.
Yeah, jack of all trades. But even though he was down for cryptozoology, he didn't believe the Patterson Gimlin film was real, although he hesitated making an assessment after seeing Dr. Grover Krantz be in favor of it. Now, he thought it had been hoaxed by a guy in a suit. His principal complaints against the thing in the film was that the hair pattern was too uniform. The hair on the breast was not primate-like. Patty wasn't alarmed enough or didn't walk away fast enough after seeing Patterson advance on her. And as we said a few minutes ago, there wasn't enough of a butt crack. That's what we also call ICS, or insufficient cheek separation.
Again with the butt cheeks.
Again.
But you know what? I kind of get that, as we mentioned a little bit before, in seeing that they don't kind of move on their own as you might expect a large human person walking away, or maybe even an ape. But I will agree that it seems a little bit seamless. You can see a line there, but he's not seeing enough jiggling, I suppose. But it's interesting, though, that one thing that he mentions is that as a zoologist, he would expect that Patty would have more of a reaction. And even though, she's a big creature, I guess he was expecting her to kind of trot faster away from them.
Yeah.
But then I would argue it's like, no, she knows she's powerful.
Yeah.
And they weren't very big guys anyway. Roger Patterson was 5'2". I'm thinking Bob is maybe 5'6", 5'7".
Well, again, you're making an estimation about the behavior of a creature that, as far as we know, doesn't even exist. So
right.
If you're applying strictly animal behavioral science to it, you're ignoring the possible influence of the human component of Patty if there is some of that in there for her, if she's real, if you believe any of this at all.
Right. That was my point early on, in that you're trying to assess what this creature is, either from the viewpoint of other apes or humans, but she is somewhere in the middle. She's her own kind of thing, and she may have slightly different behaviors that are not expected of either. So that was interesting from his perspective, but it also seems he had a lot of respect for Grover Krantz and was hesitant to make a declaration one way or the other, even though the reflexive one is just to say it's a guy in a suit.
Right.
But he ended up believing it was a guy in a suit, or at least stating that anyway. So who's our next gentleman, though? He seems to be all over the YouTubes.
Well, yes, he's more current. He's the one that a lot of present day or people who are maybe new to the research on it would know of. His name's M.K. Davis. Mm-hmm. And he has worked with Bill Munns, who we'll be hearing from on some things. And Davis and Jeff Glickman had done their own image stabilization, which you can see on YouTube.
I know that Jeff Glickman has done his own, or maybe was the first one to attempt an image stabilization on the film, according to David Daegling. So I'm not sure when M.K. Davis did his own, or if he did do his own. I believe he has, though. So I'll say that. I think he has done
it does get a little confusing. A lot of people have stabilized it. Image stabilization is available to the masses now.
Right.
Having formerly worked in post-production, I remember when it came out, or when you could first get to it in After Effects, which is an application that you can do pretty much anything with. We always mention Captain Disillusion.
Oh, yeah.
He shows you how you can use After Effects to create any kind of crazy vortexes in the sky or whatever. But the thing about image stabilization is, everybody obviously gets the idea of what it does. It takes shaky camera footage and it smooths it out. Now, they've had stuff for this for the camera user for decades. They have had the Steadicam, which, if you haven't heard of that, if you're a sports fan, you'll see them guys wearing them on the sidelines at football games. But it's this big rig with gyroscopes in it that keeps the camera smooth no matter how the person is moving that's operating it. And one of the first uses of a Steadicam in a feature film was actually The Shining, believe it or not, in the scene in the maze. The Steadicam operator was having to run backwards in the snow. That was a legendary kind of breakthrough moment. But that's applying it when you're actually shooting it.
And that's mechanical.
It's mechanical. Yeah. It's got gyroscopes and all kinds of counterbalances and that sort of thing. There are simpler versions of Steadicams. There's one called a Steadicam Junior that actually just works where you have a gimbal and there's a weight hanging down, and that works more on just inertial resistance that keeps your camera smooth.
Right.
For me, when I'm looking back, I seem to remember that image stabilization came out in software, in digital nonlinear post-production and editing and that sort of thing. It was first available back in the mid-2000s at a point where it was practical. It was available earlier, but you would try to do it. It wouldn't look right. You'd have to wait like 25 minutes to render it, and then you play it, and it's like crappy, and then you got to do it again. You literally spend the whole day doing something that you can do now on your iPhone in a few seconds.
Right. When this was done, according to David Daegling, what he stated was that Jeff Glickman had accomplished stabilizing the film, and Daegling saw this version back in 1996.
Right.
And he was pretty impressed with it, because this is where Glickman had lined up the same registration points in different frames of the film. So basically, you could take a connect the dots outline of maybe where Patty was at her joints and where she's moving in one frame, and match that to a consecutive frame with the same registration points, and then you line those up. And then when you play that back, what people will notice is that then the background really looks like it's jumping around.
It jumps all around, right, because you're selecting an object in the frame and telling it to be still.
Yes, exactly. Right. So then the background has to jump around. Something has to move, but Patty is still, and the results are amazing. And it effectively eliminates the camera shake to at least a much more viewable degree. So
again, this is another invention that Roger Patterson could have never dreamed was possible when he shot this film, if he was making a hoax.
Right.
He never could have imagined that it would be possible to stabilize that footage while he was running and really take a very close look at that 16 millimeter film.
And then there are arguments where people will say, well, he was shaking the camera at first to kind of confuse people and make it blurry. That's why, it's out of focus, it's blurry, it's shaking on purpose. Well, again, the first part is shaky when he's up and running, according to him, and then he settles down when he's able to crouch down on a knee, I think, at that log.
Yeah, after he falls. Too.
Yeah, right, and stabilize the camera. And the actual film is not all that blurry and grainy. Again, I want to make this point because I see this even in the literature when people are talking about it, that, it's really grainy, it's blurry, it's not good footage. It actually is good footage. It's just what you're seeing of Patty when she's in close-up is being blown up completely. So when you see that high definition or the 5K image that's on our website of the whole frame, you can see she's actually little in the whole frame around her. So she's being blown up, and then you're seeing the film grain, which for its time in film stock was actually pretty good. But getting back to M.K. Davis, he's on the show Killing Bigfoot, which I do not watch because I don't have cable, but I did happen to catch an episode of it, and you get to see him at his home, his little laboratory setup where he's got microscopes and he can analyze things like hair and film, and he's really serious about it. And he's posted a lot of quality videos on YouTube with some interesting analysis where he goes through and he just talks about it, and he knows his way around a computer, I'll say that. And then as far as Photoshop, he knows what he's doing. So he's able to present pretty compelling evidence on his own and has put forth quite a bit. But there was something that he found apparently in one of the frames that is a little bit controversial, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a flash like in a single frame of the film, and Davis came to the conclusion that it was a muzzle flash, or that a bullet had been fired from a gun and it was a shot from a gun. And then this just goes into this entire theory about the possibility of a Bigfoot massacre at the hands of loggers who apparently when they come across Bigfoots, they're supposed to keep it quiet so they can keep logging. I mean, there's just this whole complex theory about it. The thing I do want to say about it is, we'll hear from Bill Munns on this. He has something to say about it. It's pretty interesting. He has analyzed the film frame by frame, every known copy of it and every available copy of it at high resolution. And he defines the flash as just an artifact on the film. And that whole theory to him is absurd, to Mr. Munns. The thing is, for every theory there is about the film, there's somebody else who thinks that theory is absurd. All due respect to both gentlemen. I personally don't believe that it's a muzzle flash, and I personally don't believe that there was a Bigfoot massacre. But that's one of the more controversial things associated with M.K. Davis.
Right.
Well, the Bigfoot massacre hypothesis.
No, but you brought up an interesting point. We just got an email today.
Yes.
As we are recording this from a listener who knows somebody who is a logger in the Olympic National Forest in Washington State and has been doing that work for a number of years. And apparently there is something in the contract which states when you get hired on that if you are to see a Sasquatch, you are not to report it at all. You have to keep quiet about it, which is it's fascinating. Because,
why do you suppose that is?
Well, the company that at least this person works for, they don't do clear cutting. They artisanal trimming, you could say. They go in and they log.
It's especially curated thinning
of
the woods.
Right. Clear cutting, it's you make bare the whole hillside or wherever you're at for years until all the trees come back. They just go in and cut trees that are ready to harvest, then go back a few years later and do it. So you're not devastating whole areas.
No, you're keeping it a renewable resource. You're allowing the other trees to thrive by removing the older trees.
Unlike the mandate that they are supposed to report endangered animals, like if you see a spotted owl, you're supposed to report it, or anything that could be harmed out in the woods, that's mandatory. This is opposite of that. You are not supposed to report any Sasquatch, although they may be endangered, who knows? But one theory put forth is that if you were to report that and then suddenly it blows up into a news item and people come in there, it's going to hamper your ability to profit from that parcel of land. So
what we're talking about here is a corporate acceptance of the idea that Sasquatch may in fact be real. And if it is, we are not to mention it because we'd like to continue logging.
Yeah, we don't need any trouble around here or reports or wackos or whatever you're going to bring in with all that attention possibly by reporting that, or who knows what authority is going to come in and squeeze you out of there. So to avoid all that, just keep mum about the whole thing.
But do report the spotted owl.
Well, you have to. That is law.
Yeah, so here's the interesting thing. Yeah. So they can get away with this because there's probably no law that says they have to report a Sasquatch.
Right.
So they can say, hey, well, we can take this one off the list of what we could get prosecuted for. because all they can do is slap them on the wrist and be like, you should have told us about there was a Bigfoot up there.
Well,
but you're not going to jail because we didn't pass a law saying that it was illegal not to report the Sasquatch you saw while you were cutting down trees.
Yeah, it has not made its way into law.
Right. And then if it does that, then the government's, we have to admit that Bigfoot might be out there. It's a whole can of worms.
You don't want to go down that Squatch road. But with endangered species, certainly there are statutes where they're trying to protect them. So you have to report that. But apparently this listener and their spouse say they know people who have seen footprints, Bigfoot tracks, and have had Sasquatch encounters themselves. Well, there you go. That goes back to one of our ideas about corporations or corporate entities doing something that's an acknowledgement of something strange, but it happens so much that they had to say something about it. And it's not like the Queen Mary where people will claim like, well, they're just doing that to sell tickets to their ghost tour.
Yeah.
There's no one going out there. These places are very remote where they're doing their work.
Well, there you go.
That's kind of coming to the end here of our scientist roundup. And I thought it would be apropos to end on some of the thoughts of Dr. Grover Krantz, just on his overview of the scientific community and their feelings in general about this topic. Because I think no matter what you feel about Dr. Krantz's observations or his stance on Bigfoot, I think they sum up very nicely, just in general, from his perspective as a scientist who was well respected. So here are just a few things I took from the Chris Murphy book, The Bigfoot Film Controversy, as far as a statement from Krantz about why this really hasn't been studied all that much and why you don't really see point-by-point debunkings from serious scientists, only a few that are willing to come forward and be proponents of the film. So Dr. Grover Krantz made some statements in his own book, Bigfoot, Sasquatch Evidence, published in 1999, that sum up his position on the PGF and the scientific community in general, which we're going to sum up right here, right now. Quote, "No matter how the Patterson film is analyzed, its legitimacy has been repeatedly supported. The size and shape of the body cannot be duplicated by a man. Its weight and movements correspond with each other and equally rule out a human subject. Its anatomical details are just too good. The world's best animators could not match it as of the year 1969, and the supposed faker died rather than make another movie. In spite of all this, and much more, the scientific establishment has not accepted the film as evidence of the proposed species. There are several reasons for this reluctance that are worthy of more discussion." End quote here. And of course, as we stated previously here, those declarations, those conclusions, David Daegling and other anthropologists thought were just a little too reckless, a little too accepting.
Yeah.
Skeptical
Krantz went into the whole thing skeptical, and then he came around on it, and then he became a kind of an evangelist for the topic, and confirmation bias probably crept into his presentation of information, but that doesn't change the fact that at the time he was a very well-respected academic mind, and his theories and ideas carried a lot of weight. So you can look at his final conclusions and say, well, at this point, he wanted to believe. He did want to believe. I believe that's the point that he got to.
Yeah.
But it's different between Dr. Grover Krantz wanting to believe and a guy in a basement who learned everything about Bigfoot on the internet in a couple of weeks.
This is exactly his specialty, like Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum.
Yeah.
you just read a few books and are really excited about it.
Yeah.
So what else did Dr. Krantz have to say?
Well, I'd like to start with this quote. "Most of the analyses of the film and its background have been made by laymen. Their studies and conclusions were published in popular magazines and books, not scientific journals. Most of these investigators did not know how to write a scientific paper or how to get one published," end quote. So if they had submitted them, they probably wouldn't have been taken seriously by the editors because the subject isn't taken seriously. Therefore, the potentially concerned scientists were unaware of the great quantity and quality of evidence. None of them wanted to look into it until someone else verified it. Since this was the prevailing attitude, not much analysis happened because no one wanted to look foolish. And that's the funny thing about this. I just want to interject here.
Mm-hmm.
You basically molded this point out of your overall analysis for this section of our show, for this series. I couldn't agree with you more, but what's happening is all the scientists that want to say that there's nothing to look at here are refusing to look at it themselves, so they can't say that with any degree of authenticity, because if they look at it, they've decided that they themselves will look silly. So what they're doing is just categorically shutting it down without actually reviewing the evidence, because they're afraid what reviewing the evidence will make them look like.
Yeah, exactly. And it's what David Daegling says is the reflexive argument.
Yes.
It was just like, no, that's stupid. Don't even look at that. And then without really analyzing it, or you look at it once and just say, that's it. It's a guy in a suit, which, Daegling himself really should be commended for taking a look, although he just can't go as far as Krantz. And I don't know, what he feels deep down, but I think he's pretty honest in his book. Just summarizing here, there are some really compelling elements to this that are worth thinking about, but I can't go that far. I can't go as far as Krantz, and Krantz shouldn't have done that either. But, it's enough to look at, and in his opinion, he wrote a book about it. So it was enough to give it some serious thought.
There's that. I know we already talked about unpacking things. I don't want to unpack this, but what I do want to do, this is another expression that seems to be creeping into the zeitgeist these days: the stay in your lane, right? And so that's a thing that I'm hearing a lot lately. And one of the things that Daegling does in his book is he gets kind of speculative on Hollywood and costume making and how costumes work, and proposes how a costume might work for Patty. And the bottom line is he doesn't know anything about that. So he is definitely not in his lane there. Yeah. Now, our whole podcast is based on us not being in any lane at all.
We're knowing anything about anything, really.
Right.
But no,
so I'm not I'm not saying, oh, look at me, I'm right and you're wrong. But what I'm saying is Daegling is not qualified to discuss what kind of costume would work, because it's pure speculation based on a brief amount of research and no personal experience.
Well, in that regard, he maybe knows as much about it as us, and maybe we know a tad more because we worked in film and TV.
Well, also at this point, I've read Bill Munn's book and had a 2-hour interview with him that everyone's going to be hearing later in the series. So anyway, getting back on point, I did want to come back to one last observation that Krantz had been making, was that Patterson's film was the first ever to purportedly show a Sasquatch in the wild. There have been many fakes since Patterson's film. Krantz had seen 8 of them, and they were all fake in his opinion. So given the amount of hoaxing, it's not surprising there's not much scientific interest in the years since. And that makes sense, because if you got all these hoaxes, your scientists can't all just sit around looking at whatever Bigfoot movie Joe Blow made last week.
Right. Yeah. Well, you get tired of it, and it really muddies the water, and then you don't even want to take a look at it. But it's not just that either, because there's another element here which is anathema, abhorrent to the scientific community, and that is, even fewer scientists want to study the Sasquatch because of the quote-unquote lunatic fringe, making connections to, quote, Sasquatch moving through space-time warps, riding in UFOs, making telepathic connections, showing superior intelligence, and the like, end quote. That's from Krantz saying that.
I feel like you might be a card-carrying member of the lunatic fringe, Mr. Forrest.
No, I do not claim any of those, but they're fun to look at, I'll say, those observations there, and maybe we'll touch on a few of those in our conclusions. But to a scientist, that's just silly. Don't even go there when you can't even have any data about any of that at all, unless you're, I guess, Robert Bigelow. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's not something a serious anthropologist, zoologist, maybe even a cryptozoologist can even consider, because that's too far out there. And the people that come in there looking to do that are really just making things worse. They're not giving any credibility to the subject. They're taking it away, because the, quote, lunatic fringe, end quote, will try and latch on to any scientist that shows an interest and try to sway them into their thinking. That's Krantz's thinking about that, is that as soon as you see a scientist, somebody from this field here that is pretty woo-woo, they're going to try and latch onto that scientist, get them to speak on their behalf about all these other crazier possibilities, and, quote, it is tantamount to academic suicide to become associated with any of these people, end quote. That was Krantz. So that's why they don't want to go there, because now you're going to be seen as even more of a wacko by your fellow scientists. And so to sum up Krantz's observations here, quote, finally and most important, Krantz says, there is the absence of any definitive proof that the Sasquatches exist at all. If this had been a known species, the Patterson film would have been accepted without question. But without the clear proof that biologists are willing to accept, a strip of film is of little persuasive value. Of course, a film like this would have been accepted as fairly good evidence for a new species of cat or skunk, But even then, the type of specimen would still have to be collected to make it official. For something so unexpected, at least to science, as the Sasquatch, the degree of proof that is required rises proportionately. What is said here about scientific ignorance regarding the Patterson film is equally true for the footprint evidence and the testimony of eyewitnesses. None of this is normally published in the scientific journals. Hoaxes do occur, and the lunatic fringe is all over the place. I don't know of a single scientist who has firmly denied the existence of the Sasquatch on the basis of reasonable study of the evidence. Instead of this, most scientists deny it because, to the best of their knowledge, there is no substantial body of evidence that can be taken seriously. End quote.
Krantz finishes the section by saying Dmitry Bayanov urged him and others to pursue experts in various related fields, but that hasn't produced any useful results, and that after his experience with the dermal ridges, he couldn't afford another full round of, quote, expert chasing.
Krantz got excited and was trying to get other experts in the field to take a look at stuff, and that's what he means by expert chasing, and it just did more damage to his career.
Yeah.
Trying to get people to be serious about this and like, come on, get out of here with this stuff, you nut job. He wasn't prepared to do that. Plus, it takes a lot of time and energy away from his other studies and research. And although this was a major part of it, it's just that he couldn't expend any more time and energy on that, and it didn't do much anyway. So even though Bayanov was urging him in the American scientific community to do something, to keep pursuing it, yeah, he just ran out of steam on that, and he had suffered already.
All right, now we want to talk a little bit about some of the Hollywood special effects movie experts and gurus that have weighed in on the Patterson-Gimlin film. And I just want to quickly point out that the very next part of this series is an extensive interview with one of those experts who has done the most out of all of them, the most looking at the Patterson-Gimlin film, and that's Bill Munns. And so you're going to be hearing from them in the next part of this series. And he will also be talking about some of these guys who he knew and worked with in many cases. Mm-hmm. But we wanted to make sure that you knew who they were before you got into his interview and what they thought of the Patterson-Gimlin film or what they said publicly about it, if they were asked about it.
If you're really into movies, you may have heard of these names before, or even if you were a red carpet watcher, maybe you've heard these names, but most people probably haven't because they're behind the scenes, but they're legendary. And if you're going to think that the Patterson-Gimlin film shows a guy in a suit, then why not hear from the people who would be the best makers of these suits in any decade? And so that's who these gentlemen are, the best of the best in making these suits. Because I will say one thing about the movie industry is many people don't take it very seriously, but they represent the craftspeople and the artists who work in that field are the very best in what they do. And if it's makeup, costumes, cinematography, all these various related fields, special effects, it's the best on the planet and always has been because movies demand it. The viewers demand it. So as technology increases and evolves, these are the best people as far as producing anything visual or of that realm of costumes and acting and all that stuff. A lot of the things we are talking about in the Patterson-Gimlin film.
Right. So one of the first guys we want to talk about before we even mention him, I do have to say, I did work with him at one point. This is a weird connection. Stan Winston.
Really?
Renowned multiple Academy Award-winning Hollywood special effects makeup creator. And when I say I worked with him, by that I mean, no, I didn't meet him at all. Back when I was working in commercials as an assistant editor, I was the assistant editor on a Super Bowl spot called Budweiser Horses.
Oh, yes.
It's in 1996, and it's where all the horses line up on the football field, and they kick the football, and they play football. And this was a big deal because the horse leg kicking the football, Stan Winston built. And it had to kick the ball, and then the wider shots, the horses are all running around or whatever. So that's my brush with Stan Winston fame.
Well, you would be in good company. One, that points out that the leg at that time, way back when, years ago when you were a kid, is prosthetic, not digital. So
completely
nowadays,
prosthetic. And then on top of that, I would also like to point out that even though it looks a lot like a horse leg, it does not move like one at all. It looks fake.
Right.
And this was 1996, 30 years after the Patterson-Gimlin film.
I see.
Yeah, the fur looks right on it, but it looks like a robot horse leg kicking a football. Just for the record.
Yes, but this guy is one of the best and one of the legendary greats in his field.
Yes, absolutely.
And again, while you're in good company here, he's collaborated with some of the biggest names in the biz. Steven Spielberg, James Cameron, Tim Burton, Robert Zemeckis, to name.
Philbrook.
Yeah, that's not in
That's
this
not
list.
on that. Why isn't that on the list?
No, and you know how I like to build lists. lists. It's just not in there. And he's been nominated for an Oscar quite a lot and won his first for Best Visual Effects for the movie Aliens. Remember that?
Oh, of course I do.
And then he was nominated for Predator. We talked about that. He was nominated, I think, also for Edward Scissorhands, won 2 Oscars for Terminator 2, won 1 for Jurassic Park, etc., etc. So Stan Winston, yeah, he's just one of the greats of makeup, visual, and even digital special effects, which he got into later.
By the way, he's no longer with us.
No. But his Bigfoot-type experience included making the Wookiee costumes for the 1978 Star Wars Holiday Special. Remember that?
Yes.
I vaguely remember that one, yeah. So that's Bigfoot-ish. And just for some of our horror fans out there, he made his directorial debut with a listener favorite, Pumpkinhead.
Oh, you can't go wrong with Pumpkinhead.
But he was not a fan of the Patterson Gimlin film, at least not publicly. Sorry to say.
Yeah.
On the mid-90s TV series Movie Magic, Winston said about the PGF after viewing it, "If one of my colleagues created this suit for a movie, he would be out of business. It's a guy in a bad hair suit. Sorry." Winston said he thought the suit could have been created for a couple of $100 or at least under $1,000 back at that time. So pretty dismissive.
Yes, he is. Bill Munns will be specifically addressing that comment in our interview with him in next week's episode.
Yeah, and we believe that there's a reason for that. But another, maybe a counterpoint here to that is Ellis Berman. Now, Ellis Berman and his Berman Studios of Hollywood had made all sorts of creatures for the movies and other attractions, and had even made a Bigfoot for a carnival exhibit, but denied making Patty for the PGF. He said he could create a similar one, but that it would cost him more than $10,000 to make. So maybe just Stan Winston had better wholesale suppliers. I don't know where he's getting the cheap deal on that.
I don't want to spoil what Mr. Munn says, but it is critically important to what he thought of Stan's analysis of the film. So I'm going to save it for next week.
Right. Well, tell us, though, about another Hollywood legend. He's another great up there, and maybe even more ape experience, but maybe of that same ilk.
Rick Baker. A lot of people will know his name. He was nominated for an Academy Award a record 11 times and won 7 times. His first for an American Werewolf in London.
Oh, that was so cool, that transformation scene.
Yeah, it was amazing. Yeah. And the werewolf creature for Michael Jackson's Thriller video.
Oh, yeah, classic.
Baker was an assistant to another special effects makeup legend, Dick Smith, for the movie The Exorcist.
Oh, yes.
But for ape-like costumes, Rick Baker is pretty knowledgeable as well, first working on the costume and acting as King Kong for the 1976 movie, having been nominated for an Oscar and winning a BAFTA award for Greystoke, The Legend of Tarzan, Lord of the Apes in '84. And then in 1987, he won the Academy Award for his Bigfoot costume for the classic Harry and the Hendersons, part of which was just for sale like last week. Remember?
One of the versions. Yeah, but not the whole thing, I think.
No.
Well, no, for the cheaper deal.
No, someone had bought the whole. No, there was a whole version of it from the film, but I think it was like $20,000.
Yeah, I think you could buy.
There's
a
note,
piece of it.
by the way. If you saw that in the woods, you would not. It was comical looking. So,
yeah, it was. Yes. Yeah.
But anyway.
But he knows what he's talking about when it comes to apes, I would say.
Yes. Yeah. And Baker also was not a fan of Patty in the Patterson Gimlin film, saying on Geraldo Rivera's 1992 show, Now It Can Be Told, that it, quote, looked like cheap fake fur. Baker also, it seems, relayed a rumor he'd heard that fellow special effects makeup creator John Chambers had sold a crappy walk-around suit, in quotes, as a, quote, gag to be played on the guy that shot it, end quote. Meaning we take it to Patterson. I don't know if this means that the bad suit was meant to cheat or fool Patterson into paying for an inferior product, but later on, Rick Baker's studio stated that Baker didn't believe that rumor was true anymore.
Yeah, it's kind of a funny thing to pass along, because you're implying that John Chambers would then be playing a joke on Roger Patterson.
Yeah.
But it's just like, yeah, he paid $1,000 and I gave him a crappy suit. And it's just a funny Hollywood insider kind of thing, hearing about John Chambers.
Well, speaking of John Chambers, let's talk about John Chambers.
Oh, another Hollywood special effects prosthetic makeup artist legend. And maybe something you don't know here. I'm sure you know it. Maybe you haven't made this connection yet. Well, Chambers is best known for creating the groundbreaking flexible face masks and prosthetics 4, Planet of the Apes movie series. Remember
yes,
that? Oh, of course. Remember Cornelius, Dr. Zaius, classics,
Yes.
right? And he won an honorary Oscar for his work in 1969 and was also the first motion picture makeup artist to receive a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame.
That was an honorary Oscar because there was no category at the time, right?
That's right. I think that category did not come into existence until 81 or sometime in the 80s. Yeah, so he was truly groundbreaking in that sense and very well respected. And he's also known for making Spock's pointy ears for the original Star Trek series.
Ooh.
Overall, you could say he knows what he's doing when it comes to ape prosthetic makeup and costumes.
Well, those ears always looked amazing.
Well, I'm talking about Planet of the Apes. Though.
Oh, I know.
Yeah,
but
he knows
Spock's
his apes.
ears, honestly,
they
you
look
get a
very
lot
natural.
of close looks at those ears, and you never see a seam.
No, he was very impressive, and he's just a really cool, impressive guy. And let me ask you this, Scott. You've seen the movie Argo, right? With Ben Affleck?
Yeah, I like that movie.
It won the Oscar for Best Picture in 2012, right?
Yep.
And you remember the makeup artist played by John Goodman who helps out Affleck?
Yes.
Well, Goodman was portraying John Chambers.
Oh, that's super cool.
It's pretty cool to put that together. Yeah, I remember the character and I thought it was a lot of fun. So as the movie was portraying the events of, there was a John Chambers and there was a Tony Mendez. Well, the real John Chambers, played by John Goodman, was really helping out the real CIA officer, Tony Mendez, being played by Ben Affleck.
Right.
And what they were doing has now become known as the Canadian Caper all these years later because it was classified for a long time, I think until the 90s, until the mid or late 90s. So the story wasn't known, and then in 2012, it became a motion picture. Well, Mendez had asked Chambers to help with rescuing 6 American embassy workers who were hiding out at the Canadian ambassador's residence during the Iran hostage crisis in 1979 and 80. And Chambers had previously worked for the CIA as a contractor, creating disguise kits for their overseas agents. Isn't that cool?
Yeah.
Tony Mendez had John Chambers set up a fake movie production office in Hollywood as part of a cover story that the 6 U.S. diplomats were working as Canadians scouting Iran for a film location for a movie in pre-production to be called Argo, which was the basis for the real movie Argo.
There you go.
So the caper worked. The Americans escaped.
Here you go with one of your favorite things in the world, a spoiler.
Dude, it's a
you
real.
Can't help it.
Guess what?
If you talk about a movie, you have to tell how it ends. It's in your nature.
Well, this is important, and you could not.
Wait, is it pertinent to the Bigfoot
It
story?
is because, as I said before, you so rudely interrupted me. The caper worked. The Americans escaped, and Chambers was awarded the Intelligence Medal of Merit from the CIA.
Yeah.
Well, see, there you go.
That's pretty cool.
Well, tell us how Chambers is connected to the PGF.
Well, he passed away in 2001. He was 78 years old, but at some point, he was probably living at the Motion Picture Country Home, a retirement community with hospital care for folks who used to work in the film and television industry. Chambers was interviewed by Bobby Short, a Bigfoot researcher, Bigfoot enthusiast, and as they are generally known, Bigfooters.
Yes, Bigfooters.
Yes, and I've actually been to that home.
Oh, you have?
Yeah, because my wife's insurance is through the Writers Guild. We had to go there for something, and it's beautiful. Like, it's way out towards Calabasas, kind of peaceful area where there must be so many legends there that you don't even really realize who they are.
Right. I think people were shocked back in the 30s, I believe, just offhand remembering the story, that there were a lot of famous actors who were dying destitute and with no help or care or family to take care of them.
That's why it got founded. Yeah. So Bobby Short, who was a registered nurse, and apparently did this while wearing her nurse's uniform, interviewed Chambers in February of 1997, specifically about the rumors that had circulated for years that he was the one who had made the ape costume for Roger Patterson. During the interview, Chambers denied any connection with the Patterson Gimlin film and gave a now famous quote about it within the Bigfooters community saying, quote, "I'm good, but not that good," end quote. Chambers went on to say that in his opinion, neither he nor anyone else could have made the Bigfoot scene in the Patterson Gimlin film. Years earlier, before 1975, we guess, because that's when their book came out, Robert and Francis Gwinnett, authors of Bigfoot the Mysterious Monster, had interviewed Chambers, and he told them, quote, that if the creature is a man in a suit, then it's no ordinary gorilla suit. It is not something they bought or rented in a store. It would have to be something tailor-made, end quote. Chambers also said that if it was a suit, then he thought it might have been made out of real animal fur.
Yeah, looked that good to him.
Chambers also admitted to Bobby Short, the nurse, that he was aware of the circulating rumors that he was the PGF ape suit creator, but never came out and corrected them because it was good for his reputation.
Again, that's a testament to the suit being very good, as we've all heard repeatedly.
Yeah.
So he's willing to take credit for it, kind of just by not saying anything.
A lot of people are willing to take credit for it, either by not saying something or by saying something. Like if you go back to the Morris family saying, hey, we made that suit. That's our suit. By the way, here's our giant store full of costumes.
Yeah, which I'd love to visit in Charlotte. But
yes, I'm planning to visit it, although they might be mad at me. So I might not say who I am when I go in there.
Look, you can look at it both ways here. One is that the suit is so good, you're willing to kind of latch yourself onto it in some way. Or think about this, the suit is so good that two of the big heavyweights in prosthetic costume making in Hollywood's have to poo-poo it. Like, no, come on, that's not that great.
We can
do that.
Right, and that's another thing that Munz talks about is your reputation as a costumer.
Right.
Is affected by how you react to something that nobody can figure out what it is.
Sure.
It's better to say, oh yeah, I could do that. Of course I can do that. Wait, by the way, I'm available for your next movie.
I have an opening, coming up. But no, because if you said, geez, that looks so good, I can't do that. It's like, well, then we're going to find somebody who can.
You.
Yeah, what do you we thought you could handle this. So of course it's easy. That thing looks like a piece of crap and you could do it in your sleep for a couple $100.
Right.
But let's talk about somebody who also made costumes, I think on his own, but he also acted in them a lot. And that's Janos Prohaska. Now, John Green had shown the PGF to Hungarian actor and stunt mime Janos Prohaska, who thought that the creature in the film looked pretty authentic.
And I want to point out here real quick, this is something that I learned from reading Munn's book. The performer in a costume like that is called the mime in general.
Yeah.
And so if you look at Andy Serkis, he would be called the mime, until he got out of the costume, which he's an amazing actor, by the way. But the person in the costume, they generally refer to it as the mime. And Munn's, when he's in his book talking about costumes, you'll hear him say the mime this and the mime that. You got to make sure the mime doesn't get too hot, isn't dehydrated, that kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
I thought it was fascinating because I didn't know that.
So Janos, or Janos, he's Hungarian, but he lived in the U.S. and got a lot of work in TV and film. He had a lot of experience playing various monsters, animals, and apes in costumes for television in the 1960s. Prohaska had played a gorilla in a few episodes of Gilligan's Island. He played an albino gorilla in the TV series Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea. And he also appeared on What's My Line? Remember that old TV show there where people had to guess what your occupation is?
I was going to say,
they've redone it a billion times now.
I actually saw that Gilligan's Island just a few days ago.
Oh, yeah? Seriously?
Yes, I did. And I did not realize that's who I was looking at.
Did you see the gorilla in it?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, right?
So that was Janos.
Yeah, exactly. He's only credited for, I think, that one episode, but he'd appeared a couple of times whenever there's a gorilla, of course.
Yeah.
So he probably brought his own costume, and they're like, well, that's pretty good.
No way. I just read ahead. Okay, I'll wait for you to say this.
Okay. He had made a monkey suit for his appearance on What's My Line. And for the original OG Star Trek fans out there, Prohaska played the Horta in the Devil in the Dark episode, which was William Shatner's favorite episode. And the very first time Bones, Dr. McCoy says, I'm a doctor, not a blank, you fill in the blank there with whatever he's saying. So, and in this case, it was a bricklayer, because when Captain Kirk asked Dr. McCoy to heal the Horta, it kind of looks like this globular stone thing.
Oh, I know what it looks like. This is what I was so excited about. I know that episode backwards and forwards.
Oh, you do?
Oh, yeah. But I'm going to let you finish this sentence before I jump in with my Spock impression.
It was a well-liked episode. Leonard Nimoy also thought that Devil in the Dark was a wonderful episode, and that Leonard Nimoy also narrated In Search Of, which did an episode on the PGF. So once again, everything is connected.
Well, and this is what I want to point out. In addition to this, the great scene in this was when Spock does a mind meld with the Horta. Because see, what's happening is it's this planet, and they're mining the planet. And the Horta is this rock monster thing, and it's killing the miners like crazy. But it turns out it's killing the miners because the miners are inadvertently killing the Horta's babies. Now I'm doing spoilers.
Oh, yeah. Dang it. You know, I was going to watch that. I know it came out in 1968.
It's your chance to revenge. 67, wasn't it? But I'm not sure what year. But the thing is, Spock does the mind meld with the rock creature. And then he famously goes, pain. That's the thing. That's the thing he gets from the Horta. The Horta is very upset because all her babies are being killed.
Right.
So it's pain. It's really a great performance from Mr. Nimoy.
Well, that's one character he played, and he made some of these costumes. I think he had to do a spot edition.
It crawled around. He would have been down on his hands and knees with this outfit on his back because it was very short and big, kind of blob rock thing that sort of moved like a hoop skirt.
So he's played a fair amount of ape creatures in costumes on TV. And, I think one main point to keep in mind here with Prohaska telling his story here is that he has a lot of experience acting in ape suits that were the best on TV at the time. Even though David Daegling would consider them schlocky, but that's all we got back then. And we all loved it. So these suits would be contemporary with the same era as what Patterson could have come up with in the mid to late 1960s. That's why I think it's important. I'm saying here's a professional costumer.
Yeah.
If Patterson had the money, he would be hiring this guy to make it.
Right.
Not maybe trying to do it himself. Or Patterson was just a natural born costume maker of the best of his generation there, but he was a rodeo rider instead.
Yeah.
Prohaska was asked what he thought of the PGF, if he thought it was faked, and he said, "I don't think so. To me, it looks very, very real." His conclusions were that to him, if it was a costume, it was, quote, remarkably realistic and sophisticated, the best costume he had ever seen. And according to Dr. Jeffrey Meldum's book, the only explanation he could come up with was that fake hair was glued directly to the actor's skin, which just imagine that nightmare. But then again, as we said before, you'd have to be Charles Atlas, the bodybuilder of the 50s, to exhibit some of that muscle definition we see with Patty and the largeness of it, unless you, again, have this whole padded silicone, bags of water, as Daegling suggests might be taking place here, to give the squish. That's the other option. If you're gluing it directly to the skin, or also, as Daegling suggests, maybe glued to a tight-fitting pair of long johns with a waffle print, it's just a lot of time doing that.
Well, and going back to our bonus episode from last week, think about everything that Jorma went through on Land of the Lost and how long that took. And then, by the way, take a look at what he looked like. It wasn't exactly the most realistic looking primate. I mean, it was based on Chaka, and so.
But which, by the way, that BBC recreation documentary,
yeah,
that's what their ape recreation of Patty looked like. It looked like Chaka.
Chaka looked better. Jorma looked better.
Oh, yeah.
That's the whole point.
His was pretty good. So, again, that's been a couple of theories put forward as far as costume fabrication, that somehow Patterson or somebody who's remained quiet to this day had taken something form-fitting. Now, spandex, according to Jeff Glickman, was not available in 1967.
And Munn
we talked about that
as well.
Yeah, we talked about that before.
Yeah.
I know, but something form-fitting, and as we said, Daegling is proposing, well, maybe it was cotton, something like that, but it would have to have been, to look that good, something that has to be form-fitting directly to the actor's skin, because you can see all this muscle definition. And then what I would put forth is that then your actor there has to be some kind of bodybuilder or somebody with huge bulk. Otherwise, then you have to figure out how to bulk up the suit to these gigantic proportions, and then you have to make it look good while you're walking in it.
Right.
So it gets more and more improbable the more you kind of stretch this out.
By the way, stretch. Don't say pun intended.
No.
So spandex actually came out 20 years later, according to Munns, 20 years later. So that's pretty interesting. In fact, I'll read this just short quote from Munn's book. In 1967, we didn't have the spandex stretch furs we have now from National Fiber Technology. We just had plain old fur cloth woven much like carpets are, with a base weave and a pile, the hair. And the base weave didn't have any real elasticity. We also had real animal pelts, like bearskins. We had wefted human hair, the stuff common wigs are made of. We had custom hand-tied lace hair, called ventilated hairpieces, like the common beards and mustaches. And we had crepe wool, which was a common theatrical hair we hand-laid and glued in place on the suit or the performer's body. Human hair and yak hair for hand-laid work was also occasionally done. Mostly suits were either real animal pelts or fur cloth. The other options were either very costly or very cheap looking. Issues of hair color and color changing, hair length, hair density, options for styling, and cost dictated the decision of which hair material to go with on a given job. So that's Munn's getting into a whole hair thing. But what I thought was important there was to mention how they didn't have, he's making very clear, there was nothing that stretched like that in 1967.
So now we've heard from the people that actually make the suits and wore them. But now let's take a look at the technicians who work at the studio, the people that might be doing more of the mechanical special effects side, or the studio technicians that would be more familiar with actually capturing it on film and who have seen animals on film in documentaries and such. The movie studio experts.
There's an interesting bit here from the Wikipedia entry regarding the film being seen by movie industry executives and their opinions, in addition to individual special effects makeup artists. Now, according to Chris Murphy, and John Green, Roger Patterson, Bob Gimlin, and Al Diatley all traveled down to Hollywood to show the PGF to the head of the documentary film department at Universal Studios, Dale Sheets, along with some other technicians. The feeling by Sheets and the others was that they could attempt to fake the costume, but they would have to create a completely new system of artificial muscles and then find an actor who could be trained to walk like that. They said it might be done, but would have to add that it, quote, would be almost impossible, as reported in Hunter and DeHenden's book. So that statement points to them being impressed with the musculature apparent in the suit and also the actor's performance if it was an actor in a suit. A quote from Dale Sheets and his team, as it appears in Dick Kirkpatrick's article from National Wildlife Magazine, May 1968, is more of the same general, non-committal, summarized consensus in that, quote, if it is a man in an ape suit, it's a very good one. A job that would take a lot of time and money to produce.
Well, more professionals being impressed with it, at least.
Grover Krantz stated that John Green showed a first-generation copy of the original PGF to Walt Disney executive Ken Peterson back in 1969, 2 years after it had been made. Peterson told Green at that time that their technicians would not be able to duplicate the film. The implication is that if Disney Studios, leaders in animation and animatronics, didn't think they could do it, then it's very unlikely Patterson could have. By the way, Munz weighs in his book on that, and he said that Disney was a poor choice at the time because their expertise was animatronics and animation, but not specifically those kinds of costumes. Now, Bigfoot researcher Peter Byrne also took a copy to Disney's chief on animation and some assistants in 1972. Now, David Daegling cites that it's not clear who exactly talked to whom and when concerning Disney, but essentially what the experts told Byrne was that they didn't have the ability to duplicate the film with their technology. Now, according to Greg Long, who wrote the book we told you about where he interviewed all the, just pretty much everybody that was ever involved, he's citing Peter Byrne. He says, when Byrne showed the film to the head of animation and the assistants, they thought it was a beautiful piece of work, but that it must have been shot in a studio. When Byrne told them it had been shot in the woods of Northern California, quote, they shook their heads and walked away.
Either you're pulling our leg or
they're completely dumbfounded by it.
Yeah,
because to them it's either, oh, this is an unknown primate, or someone is way better at what we do than us.
Yeah, it's kind of mysterious. I mean, you can read that quote, of course, in the wiki entry, but it's like, it kind of leaves it there. And it's like, well, what is their reaction? It's like, I took it to mean like, get out of here, you nut, you're pulling our leg.
Yeah.
In that maybe, or we don't know what it is and we just have to walk away.
Yeah.
It's like, we can't comment on that. I don't know what that is, but you seem to be better than us.
Yeah, and as I said, mine's opinion is that Disney and Universal Studios experts weren't the most knowledgeable studios to ask about this because their specialties were animation and animatronics. And still, one of the leaders of both, anthropologist and author David Daegling, has an interesting thought about posing questions to Disney Studios regarding those two specialties. Daegling says that the exact question you ask the Disney technicians is important. If you ask them if they could produce this scene in animated form and the answer is no, then it just means the special effects couldn't create that scene in the film. If you ask them if they could have gone out in the woods and produced these images and the answer was no, then it means they couldn't have created that scene which Patterson did, even with all their resources and expertise.
Yeah, you know what he's talking about here. Basically, it's like it's between one of just being possible,
right,
and it being impossible for them, but possible for Roger.
Right.
So, yeah, it depends on what you're asking him then. And as he's saying, it's not really clear what the conversations were. There aren't any records of those, just the testimony of Byrne having gone down there and what we heard from the three guys when they went to talk to some experts. But essentially what you're getting around to is that the important question here is whether a human or a machine could have been the thing that was filmed. And essentially what the Disney techs said was that if they were tasked with making a Bigfoot movie, they would rather draw one than build one. You know what I'm saying? So it's a little easier to make it a cartoon than actually build an animatronic that could walk.
And if you're wondering, and we've addressed this previously, but if you're wondering if the image of Patty walking could have been optically placed into the footage of the scenery, John Green checked that out too. Green gave the film to Canna West Films Limited for analysis. Their technicians were convinced that no special effects of the time could have placed the Sasquatch image into the scene in the film. What you see on the film was there at Bluff Creek, and Bill Munns confirms this later with his more detailed analysis.
Yeah.
Now, his opinions about Disney and Universal being the best studios to consult about this, like I said, we're going to hear about that later on. But for now, Munns thought that the Fox and MGM movie studios would have been better resources to consult because of their experience, and that specifically Stuart Freeborn in England would have been the best guy to consult for special effects prosthetic makeup, because Freeborn had recently created the groundbreaking ape costumes for Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, which was produced by Kubrick and distributed by MGM.
Well, there you go. We've heard from the people that do that for a living. Make apes walk around and beat up skeletons with bones.
Yes.
But that's the best that you have seen on film.
At the time.
I know people like, well, why are you looking at movie people and talking about them? Maybe let's get back to the scientists. Some of you, maybe a lot of you are saying, why are we still talking about this at all? The idea here is that
those people aren't saying that because they
turned
it off already.
I would suspect, though, some people like to complain at us and then keep listening.
Yeah,
we
know you're out there.
Yeah, it's like the terrible meal you still finished. It's like, this was awful, but I ate all of it. As we close out this section on the scientific experts and the movie experts, is that it's a never before seen, or at least at that point, weird creature that nobody can really get a handle on. Is this an ape? Is it a human? Is it a guy in the costume? It is something in between. If it is a guy in a costume, then who are the people that do this professionally? Well, those are the movie special effects people. Because if anyone was going to create a costume, you would have to know their skills and expertise and have some kind of access to the proper materials. If it was a guy in a suit. If it wasn't a guy in a suit, then maybe that thing is real. And what are the implications there? But no matter these two possibilities, the only thing we can do to properly analyze it in a logical and scientific manner is to go back to the film itself, which is why our next guest, I think, is perfect to hear from, because not only is he an expert in creating motion picture special effects, costumes, and prosthetics, he's also now become an expert in analyzing the film itself.
That's going to wrap up part 4 of our series on the Patterson Gimlin film. We'll be back next week with our interview with Hollywood costume designer and creature-making expert Bill Munns to discuss the idea of Patty being a man in a costume, as well as Bill's in-depth analysis of every frame of every known copy of the Patterson Gimlin film.
Please remember to support our sponsors. They help keep the show free and the lights on in Blanket Fortiana.
Special thanks to John Bolin.
Hello, folks. I'm General Josh Mikowski from Erie, PA.
My name is Jennifer.
Hi, I'm Rachel Stokes.
Pepperoni ball.
I'm sick. Here we go.
Galaxy-wide in perpetuity.
Our show is edited by Sarah Voorhees-Wendell and co-produced by Tess Feifel, who is also our head of research.
Our theme, which is available as a ringtone, was composed by Judson Crane, and our sound design and additional composing is by Ryan McCullough.
Special thanks to the Astonishing Research Corps.
But most importantly, we want to thank you, our listeners. Visit our store at astonishinglegends.com or interact with us and other listeners on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.
You can also support the show at patreon.com/astonishinglegends, where patrons have access to additional bonus content. No part of this show may be reproduced anywhere without permission. Copyright Astonishing Legends Productions.
Good night.